The Mafia King found his first love working night shifts. She was raising his son. He survived bullets, betrayal, and a decade of silence. But nothing in 20 years of ruling this city prepared Dorian Vescari for the moment a 9-year-old boy pressed a hospital towel against his chest wound and looked up at him with his own gray eyes. One heartbeat, one look. And the most feared man in the city stopped breathing. Because that boy wasn't a stranger. That boy was the secret a woman buried 10 years ago to keep Dorian alive. And now the same people who wanted him dead have found the child. If you've ever loved someone so much you destroyed yourself to protect them, stay until the very end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The night Elena Mercer almost lost everything started the same way. Every night started, with her feet already hurting before she crossed the parking garage. She'd been awake for 19 hours. The diner shift had run long because Marcus called out sick and nobody covered the back tables. So she'd worked them herself, running plates of eggs and toast to retired men who tipped in exact change and college kids who didn't tip at all. After that, she'd taken the crosstown bus to the Hallworth building, badge in, badge out, emptied 37 trash cans in the executive suites on the 11th floor, stripped and mopped the executive bathroom that always smelled like somebody's bad decisions, and clocked out at 6:47 in the evening. She'd picked Noah up from aftercare at 7:15, made him a grilled cheese and a bowl of tomato soup, helped him with a fraction worksheet that took longer than it should have because she was too tired to explain why a numerator was called a numerator, and honestly she wasn't sure she remembered anymore. Waited until he fell asleep, his reading glasses slightly crooked on his nose, a library book about deep-sea fish still open across his chest. Then she drove back across the city to start her overnight shift at Mercy General's emergency intake desk. This was her life, not a story she told herself at night to feel sorry for herself, just the arithmetic of it. 3 jobs, 1 child, 0 margin for error. She badged into the ER entrance at 9:58 and settled behind the intake desk, logging into the system while the day shift clerk, a heavy-set woman named Patrice, gave her the rundown in the compressed shorthand of people who've been doing this long enough to strip everything down to what matters. 2 overflow beds in Hall B, both waiting on labs. Psych hold in room 4, keep the door closed. He's been singing since 7. Vending machine on 2 is out of the trail mix again, which I'm taking personally. And we had a drive-by come in around 9. The victim's stable, but his people are being difficult in the waiting room. Security's watching them. How many? 4. Dressed like money but acting like something else. Elena nodded, pulled her hair back with the elastic she kept on her wrist, and Patrice was already gone, coat on, keys in hand, the particular speed of a woman with somewhere better to be. Elena understood that completely. She just didn't have one of those anymore. The first 2 hours were routine. She processed an elderly man with chest pains. Not cardiac, it turned out, just reflux and terror, which she thought were underdiagnosed as a combination, a teenager with a fractured wrist from a skateboard fall, and a young woman who came in alone and quiet and needed forms and privacy more than she needed speed. Elena gave her both. She knew how to read a room. 10 years in emergency intake taught you things no training manual ever covered. Around midnight, the waiting room thinned. The 4 men Patrice had mentioned were still there, seated in a diamond formation that looked casual but wasn't. They weren't looking at their phones. They weren't talking to each other. They were watching every door. Elena kept her eyes on her screen and her peripheral vision on them. At 12:41, the ambulance bay doors blew open. It wasn't the doors themselves, pneumatic, they opened at a push. It was the energy that came through them. 4 paramedics moving at the particular compressed urgency that meant the patient on the gurney was still close to the edge. A 5th man she didn't recognize moved alongside the gurney with his hand pressed flat against the patient's left side. And he was bleeding too, 2 fingers dark and slick with it, his jaw set like something had been bolted shut behind his face. The patient on the gurney was large, broad across the shoulders, well over 6 feet, even lying down. And his shirt had been cut open by someone in the field. The wound beneath the compression dressings was low on the right side, entry wound, possibly through and through based on how the paramedic on the left was holding the board. Then he turned his head. Elena looked up from the triage form she'd pulled automatically from the drawer, and she saw his face. The world didn't stop. That was a thing people said, and she'd always found it ridiculous. A narrative convenience for moments that were actually just ordinary sensory overload. The world didn't stop. Her hands did. Just for a second. Just long enough for the pen to press down too hard and tear a small crescent into the upper corner of the triage form. Dorian Vescari. 10 years. He looked like 10 years had happened to him. Not badly, not in the way that diminishes a man, but in the way that clarifies one. The softness that had existed around his jaw when she'd known him was gone. The face was harder, the line of his mouth set differently, something in the set of his eyes that hadn't been there before. But the eyes themselves were the same, gray and deep, and the kind of steady that most people mistook for coldness. She knew better. She'd always known better. She lowered her face to the form before he could see hers. "Gunshot wound, right flank," the lead paramedic called out, already rattling off vitals. "BP 90/60 and falling, pulse ox 92. We got one line in the field. He was conscious on scene." "Still conscious," Dorian said. His voice was the same too. Lower maybe. More weight in it, but the same. "Room 3, Elena said. She said it to the paramedic. She did not look up. "Dr. Vasquez is on trauma tonight. I'll page her now." She paged Dr. Vasquez. She logged the intake. She did everything she was supposed to do with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had spent 10 years building walls out of procedure and routine, and she did not look toward room 3 again. The 4 men in the waiting room were on their feet. She looked at them now because she had to, because that was her job, and she held up one hand. "He's in trauma. Someone will update you when there's something to tell you. Sit down or I'll have security move you outside." One of them, older, silver at his temples, a scar along his left jawline that had healed badly, looked at her with the specific, evaluating look of a man who spent his life deciding whether people were threats or not. He sat down. The other 3 followed. Elena pulled her phone from her cardigan pocket and typed a text to her neighbor, Mrs. Farida, who had a spare key and had done this before. "Can you check on N? Might be a long night." Then she put the phone back, pressed both palms flat on the desk surface for exactly 3 seconds, and got back to work. She didn't go home at 7 in the morning. She was supposed to. Her shift ended at 7 and she had a gap until 9 when Noah needed to be at school, and she usually drove home, got him up, made him breakfast, walked him to the corner, and watched him meet his friend Caleb before she went back to the apartment and slept for 4 hours before the diner opened again. That was the schedule. The schedule was the architecture of her life, and without it, everything collapsed. But Dr. Vasquez came out of room 3 at 6:15 and found her at the desk and said quietly, "Your patient in 3 is stable and asking for water and also asking about the intake clerk." I told him I didn't know who he meant. He said, quote, "The woman with the green cardigan and the pen she was trying to hide behind." Elena was quiet for a moment. "What did you tell him?" "I told him she'd gone home." "Thank you." Elena. Dr. Vasquez was 53 and had the careful directness of a woman who'd seen too much to waste energy on softness. "Do you know who that is?" I processed his intake. "That's not what I asked." Elena looked at her. "I know who he is." "Then you know that those men in the waiting room aren't friends of the family, and you know that whoever put a bullet in him tonight is probably wondering why it didn't finish the job." "I know." "Okay." Dr. Vasquez had the wisdom to leave it at that. She went back to her rounds. Elena started packing up the desk for the incoming shift. Her hands were steady. She'd made them steady a long time ago, through practice, through repetition, through the daily discipline of not letting herself feel anything she couldn't afford to feel right now. She was almost to the door when she heard Noah's voice. She stopped so fast her sneaker squeaked on the linoleum. Because Noah was supposed to be home. Noah was supposed to be asleep. Mrs. Farida was supposed to be watching him. And yet his voice, unmistakable, the particular bright-edged confidence of a 9-year-old who'd learned early that adults would underestimate him and had decided to use it, was coming from the direction of room 3. She turned around. The door to room 3 was partially open. The silver-haired man who'd been watching exits all night was standing in the hallway just outside it. and he was looking down at Noah with an expression she couldn't fully read from this distance, something between amusement and alarm. Noah was holding what appeared to be a small stack of folded washcloths from the supply cart in the hallway and explaining something with the particular pedagogical patience he used when he felt adults were missing the obvious. Because compression needs to be maintained even after the initial bleed slows. It's capillary pressure. I read about it. Is the compress on his wound from before? Because if it's soaked through, you need a new one, and you need to apply it with more force than you think. Elena was moving. Noah. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, which meant she'd scared herself. He turned. He had her dark hair and her narrow face, but when he turned and she saw his eyes, gray, deep, luminously steady even at 9 years old, she felt the same thing she felt every day and had learned to live with the way you learn to live with a stone in your chest. She loved him more than any calculation she'd ever made, and he had his father's eyes exactly, down to the particular set of them when he was concentrating on something. Mom. He wasn't alarmed. He was rarely alarmed. Mrs. Farida fell asleep, and I woke up, and you weren't home yet, and I got a ride with Mr. Pereira from downstairs because he drives overnight for the app. We'll discuss this later. She took the washcloths from his hands. How did you get back here? I told the front desk I was looking for my mom, which was true. The silver-haired man made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Inside, Elena said to Noah, tilting her head toward the waiting room. Sit down. Don't talk to anyone. I'll be 2 minutes. The man in room 3 needs a clean compress, Noah said. Not defiant, just informational. I'm aware. He said his name was Noah. Waiting room. Now. He went. He had the particular dignity of a child who has learned when his mother's voice means business, and he went with his head up and his library posture and the washcloth still in his hands because she'd forgotten to take them back. The silver-haired man was watching her now. Something had shifted in his face. She said without looking at him, "Excuse me," and pushed the door to room 3 the rest of the way open. Dorian Vescari was propped up against the inclined bed, the compression dressing on his right flank clean, someone had changed it in the last hour, and an IV drip in his left arm. His shirt was gone. He was watching the door when she came through it like he'd been watching it for some time. The silence was enormous. "Elena," he said. She kept her voice level. "You need anything from intake? I can get the day shift clerk to—" "Sit down." "I'm not a patient." "I didn't say you were sick. I said sit down." She stayed where she was. "You're stable. The bullet nicked your liver. Dr. Vasquez will explain the next steps. You'll need to avoid significant movement for—" "Who is that boy?" The question landed exactly the way she'd known it would. She'd known it for 9 years. She'd played this moment in her head 900 times, rehearsed every version of it, built 3 different answers for 3 different versions of how it could go. And standing here now, at 6:37 in the morning, with 19 hours of wakefulness grinding behind her eyes, all 3 answers turned to dust. "He's my son." Dorian looked at her. Just looked. She watched him do the math. He was always fast, always had been, the kind of intelligence that moved in straight lines and didn't flinch when it arrived somewhere difficult. She watched him arrive at the number 9 and match it against the 10 years she'd been gone. "How old is he?" She didn't answer. "Elena." "9, she said. "He's 9. The silence that followed had a different texture than the first one. She recognized it. She'd felt it herself 10 years ago, in a parking structure a lot like the one downstairs, when a man she'd trusted had shown her a document that turned her whole life into a decision she hadn't asked to make. "You left," Dorian said. His voice was controlled, just barely. "You left, and you never—" He stopped, started again. "I looked for you." "I know." "For 3 years." "I know." "Then you know why I stopped." "You stopped because I made sure you would," she said. "I needed you to stop." His jaw tightened. That was the only tell, the jaw, and the way his right hand flattened against the bed rail. "You needed me to stop while you were—" He didn't finish it. He looked at the door, then back at her. "He has my eyes." She could have denied it. She'd told herself for years that she could deny it if she had to. Yes, she said instead, because she was too tired. Because 19 hours of exhaustion had finally burned through the last of her carefully maintained composure. He does. Does he know about me? He knows your name. That's not... He asks about you every birthday, she said, and her voice didn't shake, but something adjacent to a shake happened in her throat, something she had to push through. Every single one. And every single birthday I give him the same answer, which is that his father was someone I loved very much, and that the situation was complicated and that someday I'd explain it better. 9 years of that answer, and he has accepted it with more grace than either of us deserves. Dorian was quiet for a long time. Outside the room, she could hear the hospital waking up. The change of shift sounds, the cartwheels, the distant intercom. Regular life grinding forward the way it always did. Why? He said finally. Just that. Not angry, exactly. Something beyond anger or before it. That's a longer conversation than either of us can have right now. I've got time. I'm not exactly... I don't, she said. I have a 9-year-old in your waiting room who took an unsupervised cab across the city in the middle of the night, and I have to get him home and fed and to school, and then I have a diner shift at 10, and this... She gestured between them, between the space of 10 years compressed into 6 square feet of trauma room. This is not a conversation I'm having in a hospital at 6:40 in the morning. You'll come back. I don't... Elena. And there it was. Not a demand, not quite. Something older than that, something that had survived 10 years of whatever he'd built himself into, that still sounded underneath all the hardness, like the man she'd known. You'll come back, or I'll find you. I've done it before and I'll do it again. The difference now is I know what I'm looking for. She looked at him for one more second, then she turned and walked out. Noah was in the waiting room, seated precisely where she'd told him to sit, the washcloth still in his lap, watching the silver-haired man with the undivided, analytical attention he usually reserved for nature documentaries. The silver-haired man was watching him back with an expression she didn't have time to interpret. Come on, she said to Noah. He stood up and fell into step beside her. They were halfway to the door when he said quietly, the way he said things he'd been turning over for a while. His eyes are like mine. Noah. I'm just saying, the man in room 3. His eyes are the same color as mine, which is kind of unusual because... I know, she said. Let's go. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Mom, is he... Not right now, she said. He nodded. He didn't push. He was 9 years old and had his father's eyes and his mother's discipline. And he understood, the way perceptive children understand without being told, that some questions were bigger than the moment they were asked in. She got him into the car. She drove 4 blocks before she had to pull over and breathe. Just breathe. Both hands on the wheel, eyes straight ahead at a street that was beginning to lighten with early morning, the city exhaling into a new day, completely indifferent to the fact that her carefully constructed existence had just developed a crack she wasn't sure she could hold together. She'd known this was always possible. Known it the way you know about catastrophes. Abstractly, theoretically, sure it could happen, but insulated by the low odds and the daily business of surviving. She'd moved 4 times in 10 years, changed jobs, kept her head down. She'd been careful. Not careful enough. Noah fell asleep in the passenger seat before she got back on the road, his head tipped against the window, the washcloth still somehow in his lap. She drove with one hand and looked at his profile in the gray morning light, his lashes against his cheek, his mouth slightly open, the library book stuffed into the outer pocket of his backpack at an angle that was going to damage the spine. He looked like both of them. She knew that. Had always known it. Had lived inside that knowledge every day for 9 years, this particular tenderness and terror that came from loving someone who was also in some essential way proof of the worst decision and the best thing she had ever done simultaneously. She thought about what Dorian had said. I know what I'm looking for. She thought about the 4 men in the waiting room in their diamond formation and their eyes on every door. She thought about a parking structure 10 years ago and a man with a manila envelope who told her that 3 members of the Vescari inner circle had decided Dorian's ambitions were outpacing their usefulness and had begun planning accordingly. that there was a timeline, that the timeline was shorter than comfortable, and that the only way to remove her as a liability, to remove anyone close to Dorian as a liability, was for Dorian to believe she was already gone, by her own choice. Completely and finally gone. She'd made him believe it. She had done it so thoroughly that she still felt, sometimes, on the worst nights, like she'd killed a version of herself to do it. And now he was 2 miles behind her in a hospital bed with a bullet hole in his side, and he had looked at her son and done the math. And whatever was coming next, whatever had started in that parking lot last night when someone decided to finish the job they'd apparently been planning for 10 years, was no longer something she could outrun by moving apartments and keeping her head down. She knew that. She'd known it the second she saw his face on the gurney. The difference between knowing it and being ready for it was a distance she had no idea how to cross. She drove. The city lightened around her. Noah slept, and in Dorian Vescari's coat pocket, in the coat someone had folded over a chair in room 3 when they'd cut his shirt off, his phone was ringing with a call from a number labeled only with a single initial. The silver-haired man whose name was Rafe and who had been with Dorian for 11 years and knew how to read his employer better than most people read books, picked up the coat from the chair, looked at the screen, declined the call. Then he looked at the door through which a woman in a green cardigan had just walked out with a gray-eyed boy who moved exactly the way Dorian Vescari had moved at that age, down to the particular straightness of his spine. Rafe set the coat back down, pulled his own phone out, and typed 3 words to a number he used rarely, only when something had shifted in the architecture of the world he was paid to maintain. Everything has changed. He sent it. Then he sat down in the chair beside Dorian's bed and waited for his employer to stop pretending he was sleeping. It took about 40 seconds. "She won't run," Dorian said without opening his eyes. "No," Rafe agreed. "She didn't look like a woman who runs. She already did run, 10 years ago." He opened his eyes then, looked at the ceiling with the particular focus of a man arranging things into order. "She had reasons." "Yes. I need to know what they were." "I've already started." Dorian was quiet. Then, "The boy. I know." I know," Rafe said again. Quiet, certain. Dorian turned his head and looked at the door. Something moved through his face, not sentiment, not quite. Something raw. Something that had no name in the vocabulary he'd built for himself over a decade of running an empire on precision and controlled force. Something that had been locked in a room for 10 years and had just, in the span of a single night shift, walked back in. "Find out what happened 10 years ago," he said. "All of it. Every piece." "And the people who put you in this bed?" Dorian's jaw set. "When I know who they are, I'll tell you what to do about them. Until then, keep eyes on her, both of them, without her knowing." Rafe nodded. "Rafe." "Yes." "If anything happens to that boy—" He didn't finish it. He didn't need to. Rafe stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked out without another word. In the parking garage 2 floors below, Elena Mercer's car was already gone. But the security camera in Bay C, the one pointed at the east exit, had caught a partial plate. And on the 3rd level, in the shadow between 2 concrete pillars, a man who had arrived in a separate vehicle from the one that had brought the shooter to the block on Meridian Street 3 hours ago was making a phone call. He said 4 words into it before he hung up. "The woman has a son." Elena stood behind the door for 11 seconds. She counted them, not because counting helped, but because it was something her hands could do while her brain sorted through what her eyes had just registered. Carver. In the hallway. On the first night Lucien was absent, she wasn't naive enough to think this was coincidence. She'd grown up in a world where coincidence was what you called things when you weren't yet ready to name them correctly. 12 years in emergency medicine had finished the job. In the ER, coincidence got people killed. Patterns kept them alive. She moved to the window, looked down at the garden, at the path that ran along the east wall, at the gate on the far end that she'd registered when the car brought her in. Locked, certainly. Probably monitored. She was not, she reminded herself, trying to leave. She was trying to understand the geometry of a situation that had just changed shape. She went back to the door, pressed her ear against it. The voices had moved. Farther down the hall, toward the west wing, toward the staircase that Renato had told her led to the lower levels, the offices, the parts of the house that were not for guests. The specific phrasing had been "not for guests," which Elena had translated correctly as "not for you." She opened the door. The hallway was empty. Wall sconces, low light, the kind of illumination that was designed to feel warm and instead felt like it was hiding something. She moved toward the sound, keeping to the right side of the corridor where the runner muffled her footsteps, and she was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she usually only was in a code, which meant her body was already ahead of her conscious mind in its assessment of the situation. The west staircase was mahogany, old, with a slight creak on the fourth step that she discovered when she put her weight on it and stopped breathing. Nothing happened. She kept going. Below, the voices were clearer. Sooner than planned. That was Carver, a second voice lower that she didn't recognize. The timeline was always flexible. He won't see it that way. He doesn't need to see it anyway. A pause. Then, she's already in the house. That's the piece we needed. Elena's foot found the seventh step and stayed there. She's already in the house. The cold water clarity from upstairs returned, and this time it went all the way down, the full immersion kind, the kind where the body understands something the mind is still arguing with. She was the piece. Not Lucienne. She was the piece they'd needed to place. She backed up the stairs, one step at a time, without the fourth step creak because she was ready for it now, and she went back to her room and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed and thought with the same methodical, affect-stripped focus she used when a patient came in with a presentation that didn't add up, and she needed to build the diagnosis backward from the symptoms. Carver ran the Belanov lending network. Lucien had said the network operated in the city at his sufferance. Carver had been in her mother's kitchen collecting a debt. Then Lucien had appeared and zeroed the debt. Then Lucien had offered her a marriage contract, and now Carver was in Lucien's house on the first night Elena was in it, talking about timelines and pieces. There were two possible architectures. The first, Carver was a legitimate internal threat to Lucien, an enemy operating inside the house, and his presence tonight was a move against Moretti that Elena had stumbled into. The second, worse architecture, Lucien and Carver were coordinated, and the debt, the rescue, the contract were all stages in the same operation, and Elena had walked into all of it willingly and signed her name to the last stage. She sat with both architectures for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called the one person she trusted to think without flinching. It rang 4 times before Danny Reyes answered, his voice carrying the specific texture of someone woken from a deep sleep. Danny was a charge nurse in the ICU, her closest friend for 8 years, and the most paranoid person she'd ever met in a way that had repeatedly turned out to be just paranoid enough. "I need you to not ask questions," she said. "That's never a sentence that leads somewhere good." "I mean it. I need information, not a conversation." A sound on his end. Sheets, probably. He was sitting up. "Okay. Robert Whitmore. He died 15 years ago, supposedly a car accident on Route 41. I need to know if there's anything in any public record that doesn't match the official story. Anything. Police reports, federal records, any news items." Silence. Elena. "Danny. Your father." "Yes, tonight. I need it tonight." Another pause. Then, "Give me 3 hours." She hung up, lay back on the bed, did not sleep. Listened to the house. The house had sounds. Old houses always did. The thermal expansion of the structure as the night cooled, the settling of weight in the foundation, the specific percussion of pipes. She cataloged them because cataloging was what her brain did when she denied it the option of panic. Around 2 in the morning, she heard the west staircase again. Footsteps going up this time, more than one person, and then the sound of a vehicle in the front drive, which she registered through the window glass as headlights moving past before cutting out. At 3:47, her phone vibrated. Danny had found 11 things. He sent them as a list, each a link, and the note at the bottom said, "Elena, this is not a car accident. Call me when it's safe to talk." She read for an hour. Robert Whitmore, whose official obituary named him a senior accountant at a mid-size firm in the Loop, had an employment history that didn't fully corroborate the title. 3 of the links were paywalled news archives, but 2 were accessible, and one of them was a 2003 article in a financial trade publication referencing a federal financial crimes task force that had been quietly assembled in Chicago that year. The article named no individual investigators, but it referenced a lead analyst described in terms specific enough that when Elena read them, forensic financial background, international wire transfer expertise, prior work with Treasury, she felt something she had no clinical term for, a specific frequency of recognition that came from somewhere below cognition. The task force had been dissolved in 2004. Her father had died in October 2004. She put the phone down, picked it up, put it down again. She slept for 90 minutes, badly, and woke to daylight and the sound of a car in the front drive. And then, 20 minutes later, a knock at her door. It was Renato. "Mr. Moretti has returned. He'd like you to join him for breakfast if you're willing." Elena showered, changed into what she'd brought. Scrubs were her default, but she hadn't packed scrubs because scrubs were for work, and this wasn't work. So she put on jeans and a gray sweater and felt the wrongness of the context sitting on her like a coat that didn't fit. She went downstairs. The dining room was at the back of the house, with windows that looked onto the garden. Morning light fell across a table set for 2, and Lucien was already there, standing at the window with a cup of coffee, in the same controlled stillness she'd registered the first time she saw him. He'd changed since traveling. He was in dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves pushed to the forearms, and he looked tired in a way that his posture was working hard not to show. "Carver was here last night," Elena said from the doorway. He turned. His expression didn't break, but something behind his eyes moved, sharp and quick, and she saw it before he could manage it back to neutral. It wasn't surprise. It was something more like a calculation being revised under pressure. "What did you see?" he said. "Him, in the hallway. 2 other men I didn't recognize. Wrong clothes for your staff. They went to the lower level. I heard 3 sentences of the conversation." She crossed into the room and stopped 6 feet from him, because 6 feet was the distance she wanted between them for this. One sentence was about me being in the house. Lucien set the coffee cup on the table. "Sit down," he said. "No." He looked at her. In the morning light, his face was harder to read than it had been in the controlled lighting of his office, and she found that detail interesting, that the context he'd designed for her showed him well, and the natural light showed him differently. "Carver," he said, slowly, "does not have authorization to be in this house." "I know, which means either you didn't know he was here, or you did." "I didn't." That's the version I'd lead with regardless. Something moved across his face that was close to anger, but controlled. The anger of someone who was very used to being believed and was encountering the specific, unfamiliar friction of credibility being withheld. "I'm aware of how it sounds," he said. "I'm telling you the truth. Carver's access to this property was revoked 8 months ago." "Then how did he get in?" "That's what I intend to find out." He held her gaze. "Sit down, please. Let me tell you what I know about Carver because it's relevant to what you heard and relevant to your safety." She sat. She kept her hands on the table, visible, which was a habit from difficult conversations in the ER. Keeping your hands visible communicated that you weren't hiding anything, and it also kept you honest about your own tension levels because you could see when they were tightening. Lucien sat across from her. He didn't reach for the coffee again. "Carver has been with my family since before I was running it," he said. "He was my father's consigliere. When I took over, I inherited him the way you inherit the structural problems in an old building. They're already part of the architecture before you understand what they are." He paused. 8 months ago, I discovered that the Belanoff network, which Carver has always nominally monitored on behalf of our organization, was not being monitored. It was being operated, directly, and for Carver's private benefit. He has been running an underground lending empire inside our territory for at least 6 years. Elena looked at him. "You moved against him." "I began to. I revoked his access. I started building a financial case. I began reallocating the network's operations. But Carver is old, and he is careful, and he has 40 years of relationships inside every criminal structure in this city." Lucien's jaw tightened slightly. "He is not someone you move against quickly, without consequences. So he's still in your organization? Officially, yes. In practice, I've been removing his capacity piece by piece. He looked at her steadily. And now he's in my house on the night of your first day here, talking about you being a piece that was needed. The sentence sat between them. You heard that, Lucian said. It wasn't a question. I was on the staircase. He exhaled through his nose, the first genuinely unguarded physical response she'd seen from him. You shouldn't have been on the staircase. You weren't home. Someone I recognized as a threat was in the hallway. She kept her voice flat. I'm a nurse. I go toward the problem. In this house, he said, going toward the problem without knowing what the problem is will get you killed. Then tell me what the problem is. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him making a decision. Not whether to tell her, she thought, but how much, and in what order, and which pieces changed the picture in ways he wanted to control. Your mother's debt, he said. I told you it was manipulated, that someone steered her toward the Belanov network deliberately. You implied it. I'm stating it now. The Belanov network was directed to approach Carol Whitmore specifically. 18 months ago, a loan officer in the network was given her name and her medical situation and instructed to make contact and offer terms that would seem attractive. He put his hands flat on the table. Carver directed this. I don't know yet why he wanted you in my house, but he engineered the entire sequence. Your mother's debt, the collection visit, my intervention, the contract. He paused. He wanted me to offer you this arrangement. The garden beyond the window was still bare, gray branches, the soil not yet ready. Elena looked at it because looking at it was something to do while her brain absorbed the architecture and found all the load-bearing places. He wanted me here, she said. Yes. Why? I don't know yet. Your best guess. My best guess, Lucian said, involves your father, and something your father found before he died. He stopped. I told you I'd tell you everything. I meant it, but I need to know first how much you already know and what you found last night, because I can see from your face that you found something. Elena looked at him, kept her hands still on the table. The Federal Task Force, she said, 2003, financial crimes. Lucien's face did something very specific, not surprise. The opposite, recognition, and something that sat beside it that she couldn't name yet, but that felt like it cost him something to conceal. He was on it, Elena said. He led it, Lucian said. The dining room was very quiet for a moment. My father, Elena said carefully, was a federal financial investigator. Yes. And he was investigating Carver's network, the precursor to what became the Belanov operation. He'd traced the wire transfers through 4 offshore shells and was 3 weeks from presenting the evidence to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Lucian's voice was even, flat, like he was reading a document he'd read many times. He disappeared in October 2004. The task force dissolved 6 weeks later. The accident, Elena said. Was not an accident, Lucian said. She had known this was coming. She had known it the moment she read the trade publication article at 4 a.m. Knowing it was coming did not make the landing easier. She felt it move through her, not as an emotional collapse because she didn't do those, hadn't done one in 15 years, but as a physical thing, a restructuring of something in her chest cavity that had been arranged around a different understanding of events and was now being rearranged. Her father had not slipped on ice. Her father had been killed by the same man whose network had imprisoned her mother, in the same city, 15 years later. She breathed. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 6 counts. Cardiac patients, panic attacks, people on the edge of the worst news of their lives. She knew the rhythm. He had evidence, she said. He hid it, Lucian said, before he disappeared. I believe, that he anticipated what was coming and put the evidence somewhere. And Carver has been looking for it for 15 years. Elena's hands had tightened on the table. She uncurled them deliberately. And you think it's connected to me? I think Carver thinks it is, Lucian said. I think he believes Robert Whitmore left something with his family, or accessible through his family. And I think bringing you into this house is Carver's way of gaining access to whatever that is. Through you, Elena said. He needed you to bring me here. Yes, which means he has leverage over you, or believes he does. Lucian's jaw was tight. He didn't answer immediately, and the non-answer was its own kind of answer. He has something on the organization, Elena said, something that makes you vulnerable if he releases it. Yes. And he's been using that to manage you, to keep you from moving against him fully. Yes. The word came out shorter than the others, and she understood that this admission was costing him something specific. Not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. The exposure of a structural weakness in a man whose power rested on the perception that he had none. Elena sat back. She looked at the garden. A bird had landed on one of the gray branches, small, brown, ordinary, and was going about its business with the total indifference of a creature that lived in the present tense. So, she said, Carver used my mother to get me here. He needed you to offer me the contract so I'd come willingly. He wants whatever my father hid, and he thinks being inside this house gets him closer to it. That's my current understanding, yes. And the assassination attempts, she said. The contract mentioned that I'd be protected from external threats. You put that in there knowing there would be threats. Lucienne held her gaze. I put it in there because in my world there are always threats to anyone connected to me. I didn't know yet that the specific threat was inside the house. Elena stood up. She needed to move. She walked to the window, put her hands in the pockets of her sweater, looked at the bird on the branch. The evidence my father hid, she said. I don't have it. I've never had it. I didn't know he was anything other than an accountant. I know, Lucian said. But Carver doesn't know that, or doesn't believe it. And while he doesn't believe it, he's going to... The sound was not loud. It was specific, a soft, splintering crack, different from the house's normal vocabulary of sounds, and it came from somewhere above and to the left, from the garden-facing side of the house. Elena's body was already moving when the window next to her head developed a small, precise hole surrounded by a spiderweb of fractured glass. She dropped. Not a decision. The body deciding for the brain, the same mechanism that moved her hands to an arterial bleed before the conscious mind had processed the blood pressure. She hit the dining room floor, and the second shot took out the window frame 6 inches above where her head had been. Then Lucien was next to her on the floor, which meant he'd also moved without deliberation, and he was on his phone already, talking in clipped sentences she didn't parse because she was assessing herself, running her hands along her arms, her sides, her neck, the systematic check that had been built into her by the same years that had built everything else. No blood, no pain beyond the impact of the floor. Stay down, Lucien said. I'm not going to stand up, she said. I'm a nurse, not an idiot. The phone against his ear. East Garden, shooter elevated, probably the Kellner building rooftop based on trajectory. Get a team on the roof and another on the south perimeter. Nobody comes in or out. A pause. No. I want him alive. He lowered the phone. They were both on the floor beneath the window line. The room looked different from this angle. The underside of the table, the chair legs, the way light fell across the floor. She was aware of how close they were, in a way that was purely physical and irrelevant, and she filed it under irrelevant. That was fast, she said. I've been here one night. Yes, Lucien said. His voice was controlled, but underneath it something was running hot. She could hear it in the slight forward lean of his consonants. That tells me someone inside this house communicated your location and schedule. Carver's people, Elena said. Someone Carver has access to. There's a leak. There are staff in this house I haven't been able to vet fully, he said. People who were here before I had authority to replace them. A pause. I'm sorry, I should have moved faster. Elena looked at the ceiling, at the fractured window above them, at the 2 holes that marked a trajectory she was going to think about later when she had more data. She was still running the diagnostic. The shooter had been elevated and slightly to the left. The angle meant the first shot was a rangefinder. It had passed through the window and embedded in the far wall rather than striking her. The shooter had adjusted for the second shot, which meant she'd dropped within the correction window, and the second shot had hit the frame. She'd been 2 seconds from a different outcome. How many people knew I was in this room? She asked. Renato, the kitchen staff. Anyone who saw Renato come to your room and relay the breakfast message. Which Carver's contact would know. Yes. She sat up slowly, staying below the window line. Her hands were entirely steady, which she noted as a physiological data point and attributed to shock deferral. The body sometimes held the tremor back until the immediate crisis resolved, then released it all at once. She would shake later. Not now. The evidence my father hid, she said. I need to help you find it. Lucian looked at her. That's not what the contract... The contract says I appear at functions and reside in the house and don't disclose terms. She kept her voice flat. It doesn't say anything about what I do between functions. And what I'm going to do between functions is figure out what my father knew, because that is apparently the only way to end the variable that is trying to kill me. She paused. Do you have his files? Anything from the task force? Some. I want to see them. Elena, someone shot at my head, she said. Twice. In your house where you told me I would be protected. I want to see the files. A long moment. Then Lucian said, Tonight, after I've dealt with what's happening in the perimeter. Tonight, Elena agreed. Renato appeared in the doorway, moving low, his face carefully blank in the way faces got when they were processing something terrible and refusing to show it. He looked at the shattered window and at both of them on the floor and said nothing. The kitchen staff, Lucian said to him quietly. I need a list of everyone who knew about breakfast this morning, who's been in contact with anyone outside the house in the last 18 hours. Pull phone logs if you need to. Renato's jaw moved slightly. Yes, Mr. Moretti. And get Elena to the interior rooms until we've cleared the garden perimeter. The library. No exterior walls. Renato extended a hand to Elena. She took it, not because she needed help getting up, but because refusing it would have been a performance, and she was done with performances for the morning. The library was on the second floor, interior, as Lucien had said. No windows on 3 of the 4 walls, the 4th looking onto an internal courtyard that was enclosed and safe. Books she didn't look at. A couch she didn't sit on. She stood in the center of the room, and she thought. At 11:15, Lucien came to the door. The shooter was gone before my team reached the roof, he said. Professional, left nothing. Of course. The contact inside the house. He stopped. The pause was not like his other pauses. This one had something different in it. She looked at him. Who? She said. A member of kitchen staff. She's been here for 2 years. His voice was careful. She received a phone call at 6:45 this morning, 14 seconds. Her phone has been wiped. Is she talking? She left the property between 7 and 7:15. A pause. We believe Carver extracted her when it became clear the attempt had failed. Elena absorbed this. She was watching the calendar to know when you'd be away. Yes. And she reported my location this morning. Yes. Elena sat down on the couch, finally, because her legs had decided they'd been doing enough. She pressed her palms to her knees and looked at the floor between her feet. The tremor she'd predicted arrived, just as she'd known it would. A fine, structural vibration in her hands that had nothing to do with cold, and she let it run because suppressing it was less efficient than letting it complete. Carver is in your house, or he has people in your house, she said. He has been here long enough to place someone in your kitchen staff. He knows your schedule. He knew my schedule on the first morning. He has a shooter on call. She looked up. He's not a consigliere who's been skimming. He's been running a parallel operation inside your organization for years. He's positioned to move against you whenever he decides the timing is right. Lucienne was quiet. And he moved this morning, she said. 1 day after I arrived, which means either I accelerate his timeline in a way you didn't predict, or... She stopped. Or what? Lucian said. She looked at him. Or he's not actually after whatever my father hid. That's a cover story, a rationale. The actual objective is to use me to get to you. A wife who dies violently in your house, in your care, creates a very specific kind of pressure. From rival families, from authorities, from people inside your own structure who would use it as a reason to challenge your leadership. The room was very still. Lucian's face, in the interior light, was showing her something new. Not the calculation she'd seen when she first walked in for the contract meeting. Not the managed presentation. Something underneath those layers, older, that might have been the specific, isolated expression of a man who had just realized the trap he'd walked into was deeper than he'd measured. "He set us both up," Elena said. "Yes," Lucian said after a moment. "You to bring me in. Me to die here and take your legitimacy with me." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Elena stood up. The tremor in her hands had stopped. She felt very clear. The particular post-crisis clarity she'd learned to trust in 12 years of emergencies, when the noise fell away and what was left was only what was actually necessary. "Then we find the evidence my father left," she said, "and we find it before Carver does. Because if he gets it first, it doesn't matter what he does with me. He has what he needs to move against you with impunity." She crossed the room toward the door. "Those files. Tonight. I mean it." She passed him in the doorway, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm, and she didn't. And she kept walking, and behind her she heard him say, quietly, in a voice that was finally, for the first time, stripped of its management, "My team swept the estate 3 months ago. Carver had a device in the East Study, active for 6 months prior." A pause. "Everything I said in that room, he heard." Elena stopped walking. "The study," she said, without turning around. "Is that where you were planning to show me the files tonight?" A silence behind her that confirmed it. She turned. He was in the doorway, and the morning light from the courtyard window fell across him in a way that showed her exactly what she'd been looking for since the first morning in his glass office above the river. The fracture line, the place where the containment ended, and the real thing lived underneath. "He knows we're looking," she said. "Yes." "He'll move before we find anything." "Probably." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them had anything useful to say about the size of what was in front of them, so neither of them said anything. Then Renato appeared at the end of the corridor, moving quickly. His face carrying the blank, careful expression she was already learning meant something had gone wrong. "Mr. Moretti," he said. "The Callahan family has called, and the Voss Syndicate, both requesting immediate confirmation of—" He stopped, looked at Elena, then back at Lucien. "They're saying you killed Marcus Bren last night. They have photographs." Lucien went still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. This was not controlled quiet. This was the stillness of a man absorbing an impact. "Bren," he said. "Yes, sir. Head of the North Territory. They're saying the photographs are from inside his estate, timestamp 2 a.m. Renato's voice was even, but his knuckles were white at his side. "If the Callahan and Voss families accept the evidence as authentic, every major syndicate in the region will—" "I was in transit at 2 a.m., Lucien said. "I was on the road." "Yes, sir." "Which Carver knows," Elena said, "because he heard everything in the East Study." Both of them looked at her. "He has your schedule," she said. "He knew where you were and where you weren't. He staged the evidence to fit the window when you could theoretically have been there. And now every family in the region thinks you've made a move against a neutral party, which means they'll move against me," Lucien said, "together, which none of them would do individually." The corridor was very quiet. "He's not going to wait for us to find the files," Elena said. "He's already executing. This is the play. Not the shooter, not the mole in the kitchen. Those were distractions. This is the move." She looked at Lucien. "How long do you have before the families respond?" "If they believe the photographs," Lucien said, 48 hours. Maybe less. Elena thought about her mother's kitchen, about the card on the table, about a marriage contract she'd signed because the alternative had seemed worse, and which had now delivered her into a house with a shooter on the roof and a war coming from every direction. She thought about her father, who had hidden something, who had known what was coming, and had tried to save the evidence before he disappeared on a dry Wednesday morning in October. She thought about what he would have done with something he needed to survive. "My mother," Elena said. Lucien looked at her. "He was protecting her," Elena said. "For 15 years, whatever he hid, He didn't use it. He hid it somewhere safe, and then he disappeared and Carol survived, which means either Carver didn't think Carol had it or Carver thought going after her was too visible. She was already reaching for her phone, but if he hid something for Carol, if he left something with the one person he trusted completely, she called her mother. It rang 3 times. 4. The home health nurse answered on the 5th ring, slightly breathless. "Miss Whitmore, I'm sorry, Where's my mother?" Elena said. "She went to her appointment. The oncology practice, doctor. She said the car came for her, the one Mr. Moretti's office arranged." "What time did the car come?" Elena said. "About an hour ago, maybe a little more." Elena lowered the phone. Lucian was already reading her face. "Carver didn't need me to find the evidence," she said. The words came out flat and precise, and the flatness was the only thing standing between her and something she couldn't afford right now. "He needed me in this house so I'd be away from my mother when he moved on her." She looked at Lucien. "He has her," she said. The home health nurse was still talking. Elena was no longer listening. She had already crossed the corridor. She was already moving toward the staircase, phone pressed to her ear, not because the nurse had anything useful left to say, but because hanging up required a decision, and every decision cost a fraction of a second she wasn't willing to spend on something that didn't matter. "The car," Elena said, cutting through whatever the nurse was saying. "Describe it." "Black, large, like an SUV, I think. There were 2 men. They both had... Did my mother seem afraid?" A pause. "No, she said she'd been expecting it. She took her purse." She took her purse. Carol Whitmore, 56 years old, 9 months into cancer treatment, had walked out of her apartment and gotten into a car sent by people who were not Lucien Moretti's people because she had been expecting it. Elena stopped on the staircase, one hand on the banister, the other holding the phone. "Thank you," she said to the nurse, and hung up. Lucien was behind her on the stairs. She could hear him, and behind him she could hear Renato, and behind Renato the controlled urgency of a household that had shifted into a different operational mode. Voices low, movement purposeful, the specific organizational sound of people who had drills for situations like this and were running them. She turned around. "She was expecting the car," Elena said. Lucien's face was very still. "She knew someone was coming," Elena said. "She took her purse. She didn't call me. She didn't call the nurse back. She didn't leave a note. She just went." The words came out with an evenness that she could hear was wrong, too even. The voice of someone who was managing something large by keeping all the muscles that produce sound very carefully controlled. "Which means she wasn't taken. She went." "Elena, where would he bring her?" Not a question about whether Carver had her mother. Elena had passed that checkpoint while she was still on the stairs. He would need somewhere contained, somewhere he controls, somewhere the family's currently convening against you can't independently access. Where? Lucien looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Not the managed distance of his office, not the hot anger running under controlled consonants. Something that was close to what she'd call grief, except that wasn't quite the right clinical term. "There's a facility," he said, "south of the city. Warehouse district near Calumet. Carver has used it for the network's collections operation. We identified it 8 months ago but couldn't move against it without... Take me there." "Elena, if Carol went willingly, take me there." He held her gaze. She held his. And she understood in that moment that whatever he was weighing, the risk calculus, the tactical considerations, the dozens of variables a man in his position ran simultaneously, he was also seeing something in her face that foreclosed the argument because he stopped making it. "Give me 10 minutes to put a team together," he said. 5, Elena said. She went back upstairs. She changed into flat shoes because she was not going anywhere in anything with a heel, and she put her phone in her left pocket and the card with the address, which she didn't need anymore but kept anyway, a habit of preserving information, in her right. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for 3 seconds. Her face looked like her face. That was surprising. She'd expected it to look different. She went back down in 4 minutes. The convoy was already assembled in the front drive. 3 vehicles, black, The same organizational silence she'd registered on the first night outside her mother's building, which now felt like it had happened to a different person in a different century. Lucien was at the lead vehicle. He looked at her when she came through the door and said nothing, which was the right response. She got in. The drive south took 22 minutes. Nobody spoke. Elena sat in the back seat and watched the city change character as they moved, the glass and steel of the north giving way to the industrial texture of the south, the lots getting larger and emptier, the buildings getting lower and more weathered, the specific topography of a city showing its infrastructure the way a person shows their spine when they lean forward. She thought about her mother taking her purse. She thought about 18 months of secret borrowing, small installments, then larger ones, $420,000 that Carol had never mentioned. She had assumed, when she learned about the debt, that it was the pride of a woman who didn't want her daughter's help, the stubborn self-reliance of someone who had raised a child alone and built a whole identity around not needing rescue. She was revising that assumption in real time, and she didn't like what the revision looked like. The warehouse was on a dead-end street with a chain-link fence that had been unlocked. The padlock was hanging open, which Lucien's lead man noted through his window and reported back in 2 words. Open. Inside. They stopped at the end of the block. I go in with 2 people, Lucien said. I go in, Elena said. You are not... She's my mother. The words came out very quiet. If she's in there and she sees your people first, whatever is happening gets complicated. She knows my face. She'll respond to my face. She paused. Put whoever you want at my back. But I go first. Another one of his calculations. She watched him run it. Sarto, he said to the man in the front seat, with her, 1 step behind. Sarto was large, quiet, with the specific economy of movement that suggested extensive practice. He looked at Elena once and then looked at the warehouse, which she took as a professional assessment of priorities. They went in through the unlocked gate on foot. The warehouse was the kind of building that had been a lot of things. Loading dock on the south side, offices on the north end, the middle and open floor with the specific acoustics of a large empty space that magnified everything. Concrete. Old industrial lighting, most of it dead. The smell of metal and moisture and something chemical underneath, faint but persistent. Voices from the north end. Not loud. Elena moved toward them. Sarto 1 step behind as instructed. Her flat shoes were quiet on the concrete. She was aware of her breathing and kept it controlled. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the same rhythm she used in a code when she needed her hands steady for a procedure. The office section was separated from the main floor by a glass partition, most of the glass intact. Through it, in the gray light of a single working overhead fixture, she could see 2 figures. One was her mother. Carol Whitmore was sitting in a chair. She had her purse in her lap, both hands folded over it, her posture entirely upright in the specific way that was Carol's version of armor. The carriage of a woman who had learned that how you held your body was the one thing nobody could take from you. She didn't look injured. She didn't look terrified. She looked from 30 feet away through scratched glass, like a woman waiting for something she had already decided about. The other figure was Vincent DeLuca. Elena had never seen DeLuca before, but she recognized him from the architecture of the situation. Older than Carver, 70s, compact, with white hair and the settled quality of someone who had not been in a hurry for a very long time. He was sitting across from Carol with his hands on his knees, and they appeared to be in the middle of a conversation that was not agitated. It was calm. That was the wrong detail, the one that stopped Elena 3 feet from the partition door and made Sarto stop behind her. Calm. Her mother and the man behind everything that had destroyed the last 15 years of their lives were sitting in a warehouse in the Calumet district having a calm conversation. Elena pushed the door open. Both of them looked at her. Carol's face moved. Something crossed it, complex and fast, that Elena didn't have time to decode before it settled into an expression she couldn't read, which was unusual because she could always read her mother. DeLuca looked at her with a mild interest that made the hair on her arms stand up, the specific unease of being assessed by something that had decided it had all the time it needed. Elena, Carol said, don't. Elena crossed the space between them. She crouched in front of her mother's chair and put her hands on Carol's forearms and ran her eyes over her the way she would run them over a patient, checking for injury, checking for the involuntary signs of distress that the body produced regardless of what the face was doing. Pulse visible at the throat, a little fast but not critical. Pupils equal and reactive in the dim light. No defensive wounds on the hands, no held posture that suggested pain, physically intact. "Are you hurt?" Elena said. "No," Carol said. "Did anyone?" "No." Carol's hands tightened over the purse. "Elena, I called the car." Elena looked up at her. "I called the car," Carol said again. "I asked to meet with Vincent. He didn't take me. I came." The office was very quiet. Elena could hear Sarto behind her, and through the partition the distant sound of the convoy vehicles idling at the block's end, and underneath everything the hum of the one working overhead light. She stood up slowly, turned to DeLuca. "Then you need to explain," Elena said, "very clearly what my mother is doing in this building, having a voluntary conversation with the man who killed her husband." DeLuca's mild expression didn't change. "Sit down," he said. "I will not." He looked at her with the patience of someone who had outweighted many things. "Your father," he said, "was not killed by my network. Your father was killed by the U.S. federal government and a man inside the Treasury Department who has been operating as a double asset for 30 years. He paused. "I've been trying to prove it for 15 years. So has your mother." Elena looked at Carol. Carol looked back at her. And what Elena had not been able to read in her mother's expression, what had been sitting behind it like a current under still water, resolved itself now into something she recognized with a physical impact, not terror, not grief. Guilt. The specific, load-bearing guilt of someone who has been carrying a secret for so long it has become structural. "Mom," Elena said. "Sit down," Carol said. Her voice was steady in a way that Elena now understood was not calm. It was the steadiness of someone who had prepared for this conversation for a very long time. "Please, sit down and let me tell you." Elena sat. What Carol told her took 40 minutes, and Elena did not interrupt, not once, because interrupting would have broken something that was already costing her mother everything it had to hold together. Robert Whitmore had not been assigned to the 2003 task force. He had built it. He had spent 3 years inside the Treasury Department identifying a network of dirty money operations that threaded through Chicago's criminal infrastructure, and what he had found at the center of it was not Carver, not the Belanov network, not anything that had a conventional criminal shape. What he had found was a federal official, a man named Harlan Voss, deputy director of a financial intelligence unit, who had been accepting payments from every major criminal enterprise in the city in exchange for making investigations disappear. Task forces dissolved. Witnesses relocated, evidence chains broken at key links. Robert Whitmore had been 3 weeks from presenting his case to the U.S. attorney when Harlan Voss had learned about the presentation. Robert Whitmore had disappeared 2 days later. The accident, Carol said, her hand still folded over the purse, was arranged by Voss. Not by Vincent's network, not by Carver. Voss used Carver's people as the instrument because that created a connection between the murder and organized crime, which meant any investigation into Robert's death would run through the criminal world and never reach a federal official. She stopped, breathed. "Vincent was the one who told me. 6 months after Robert died, Vincent came to me and told me what had actually happened and who had done it and why." Elena looked at DeLuca. "You knew my father," she said. "Robert and I had an arrangement," DeLuca said. His voice was neither apologetic nor performative, factual. "He was building a case that would have destroyed my operation along with Voss's. We negotiated. He would take Voss down and create a clean break. The criminal operations he documented would be given 18 months to restructure or dissolve. In exchange, I gave him Voss's financial records. The offshore accounts, the payment histories, the asset transfers." A pause. "Voss discovered the arrangement. He moved before Robert could present. I was not able to protect Robert in time." The overhead light hummed. Elena absorbed this. She was doing the diagnostic again, building it backward from symptoms, finding the load-bearing structure. Voss is still operating, she said. Voss retired from federal service in 2007, DeLuca said. He is currently a private security consultant with offices in 3 cities, and he has spent the last 15 years quietly ensuring that no credible evidence of what he did in 2004 ever surfaces. He looked at Elena with that specific settled attention. He is also Carver's primary financial backer, the Belanov Network's offshore structure, the one your father was originally investigating, runs through 2 of Voss's shell companies. Elena felt the full geometry of it arrive at once. Carver doesn't work for you, she said to DeLuca. Carver works for Voss. Through your organization, but not for you. Carver was placed inside the Moretti organization by Voss 15 years ago, DeLuca said. He is not a consigliere who went corrupt. He was corrupt from placement. His entire function has been to position Voss's financial interests inside what appeared to be a legitimate criminal hierarchy, which gave them insulation from federal scrutiny. Because who investigates organized crime for money laundering on behalf of a federal official? Elena said. Precisely. She looked at her mother. And you've known this. Since 6 months after your father died, Carol said. Yes. 15 years, Elena said. Carol's chin came up slightly. The armor posture. There was no safe way to move. Voss has reach inside federal structures. Anyone we brought it to could have been, You should have told me. The words came out very quiet, the quiet that happened when the thing being said was too large for volume. You should have told me years ago. Instead, you borrowed $400,000 from a criminal lending network and nearly got us both killed. I borrowed the money, Carol said, because the cancer treatment is real and the copays are real, and I didn't want to use Vincent's resources because that would have made us visible. I was trying to stay invisible. Her voice cracked on the last word, the first fracture in 40 minutes of careful steadiness, and she pressed her lips together and held it. Elena looked at her hands. She had stopped feeling her hands, which was the dissociation response she sometimes had after a very long code when the adrenaline finished metabolizing. She pressed her palms against her thighs and felt the pressure come back. The evidence my father hid, she said to DeLuca. It exists. Robert created 3 copies, DeLuca said. He gave one to me as part of our arrangement. Voss's people found it in 2006. My systems were compromised during a federal operation that was, we later understood, actually a Voss-directed retrieval exercise. The second copy was held by a colleague of Robert's inside the task force, who died in 2009. He paused. The third copy Robert kept. He told me he had placed it somewhere he trusted completely, outside any system that could be monitored. Elena looked at her mother. Carol opened the purse. Inside was a phone. Old, not Carol's phone. A model from at least 15 years ago with a cracked screen protector and a case that had been handled so many times the corners had worn smooth. Carol placed it on her knee. He mailed it to my sister in Ohio 3 days before he disappeared, Carol said. She held it for 6 months and then mailed it back to me when she was dying of something else entirely, and I have had it in the lining of a winter coat in my closet for 11 years. She looked at Elena. I didn't know what was on it. I was afraid to find out. I was afraid that finding out would make it real in a new way, and then I was sick, and then... She stopped. And then you signed a contract with Lucien Moretti, and Vincent came to me and told me that Carver was moving, and I understood that the time for staying invisible was over. Elena reached out and took the phone from her mother's knee. It was lighter than she expected. Old phones always were. She'd forgotten that, the way old phones were lighter because they carried less. She looked at DeLuca. This is what Carver thinks I have, what he thinks I came here to find. What Carver thinks, DeLuca said, and what Voss has instructed him to recover, yes. And Lucien. She looked at him. Does Moretti know about Voss? DeLuca's expression shifted by a fraction. Lucien knows that Carver is corrupt. He does not know the full depth of the connection to Voss. I have been managing the disclosure of information to Lucien carefully because you're not sure you trust him, Elena said. Because I was not sure the timing was right, DeLuca said. It's the same thing. He looked at her with something that might, in a different face, have been respect. Yes, he said. It is. Elena stood up. She put the phone in her jacket pocket. She looked at her mother, who was sitting with the empty purse in her lap now, her hands loose, and who looked smaller than she had when the purse was full. Not physically smaller, but in the way a person looks when they have put down something they've been carrying for too long, and the absence of it has changed their posture. "You're coming back to the estate with me," Elena said to Carol. Carol started to protest. "You are not staying here, and you are not going back to the apartment," Elena said. "Wherever Voss and Carver believe the evidence is, they now know you were involved in producing it. The apartment is not safe." She looked at DeLuca. "Is she safe at the Moretti estate?" "Safer than anywhere else right now," DeLuca said. "Lucien's perimeter security, whatever its current vulnerabilities, is more robust than anything I could arrange on short notice." "Then she comes with me." Elena looked at her mother again. "We will talk. Everything. All of it. Not today, because today there isn't time, but soon. Everything." Carol nodded. Her eyes were wet, and she wasn't trying to hide it, which was the most unguarded Elena had seen her in years, and it made something in Elena's chest do a complicated thing that she didn't have room for right now and filed for later. She turned to DeLuca. "The family's Carver has mobilized against Lucien. The Callahan family and the Voss syndicate. That's not a coincidence of naming." "The Voss syndicate," DeLuca said, "was established by Harlan Voss's son in 2018. It operates independently of Harlan's official activities, but reports to him financially." He paused. "The photograph evidence implicating Lucien in Marcus Brenn's death was produced by Harlan Voss's people and distributed through Carver's network." "Brenn," Elena said. "Was Brenn connected to any of this?" DeLuca's face did the thing that old men's faces did when the answer was complicated, and the simplest version was also the most brutal. "Marcus Brenn was the fourth member of the 2003 task force," he said. "He was the one who survived until 2024 without Voss finding him, because Brenn had agreed to stay silent in exchange for his life." A pause. "Brenn reached out to me 3 weeks ago. He said he was ready to come forward. He said he had his own corroborating records." The overhead light hummed. "He's dead," Elena said. "He was found 4 days ago," DeLuca said, "before I received the photographs of his estate with Lucien's presence fabricated into them." Elena stood very still. She was doing the full diagnostic now. The complete picture, every symptom, every presenting fact, every piece of timeline laid out in sequence, and the diagnosis that assembled from the pieces was one she'd been circling for the last 24 hours and was only now ready to name directly. This was not a criminal organization's internal power struggle. This was a 15-year cover-up being maintained by a federal official with criminal assets, and the cover-up had just entered its final phase because the evidence that could unmake it had surfaced, and Harlan Voss was moving to eliminate every person connected to it. Her father, Brenn, her mother. Lucien as a collateral consequence. Frame him, destroy his organization, eliminate the structure that DeLuca worked through, and you remove the last organized opposition that had any reason to pursue the truth, which meant Elena and the phone in her pocket were the only remaining leverage against a man with 30 years of federal relationships and a criminal empire behind him. She looked at DeLuca. "We need Lucien in this room." "Yes," DeLuca said. "You're going to tell him everything, all of it. The arrangement with my father, Voss, your role in managing information, everything." DeLuca held her gaze. "Yes." "Because if you don't," Elena said, "I will." Something moved in DeLuca's face. Not the mild interest from earlier, something with more weight behind it. He looked at her in a way that reminded her of the way Lucien had looked at her in the dining room that morning. Like the calculation was being revised. Like something had been filed under one category and was being moved. "You're Robert's daughter," DeLuca said. It wasn't an observation. It was a recognition. "Call Lucien in," Elena said. DeLuca made a phone call. 30 seconds. Then he put the phone down and looked at the door. Lucien came through it 90 seconds later. He had Sarto and one other man behind him, and he swept the room once with his eyes. Carol, DeLuca, Elena, and he stopped on Elena's face. "She's all right," Elena said about Carol. "Sit down, both of you." Lucien's eyebrows moved fractionally. I said sit down, Elena said.
Betrayal boss Sam.
Because what's about to happen requires everyone in this room to be in the same position, on the same level. And I need it to go fast because we have less than 48 hours before Carver's family coalition becomes a war. And I need you to understand the full picture before we figure out how to use what's in my pocket. Lucian sat down. He looked at DeLuca, and the look between them was old and complex and had about a decade of history in it that Elena would have found interesting at another time. Vincent, Lucian said. DeLuca looked at him. Lucian, he said. And then he said, I owe you a great deal of truth. Tonight I'm going to give it to you. What followed was 45 minutes that Elena did not interrupt. DeLuca spoke with the same factual evenness he'd used with her, building the architecture piece by piece. The 2003 task force, Robert Whitmore, the arrangement, Voss, Carver's placement, 15 years of managed silence, Bren's death, the fabricated photographs. He held nothing back that Elena could verify, and she was watching for omissions the way she watched for symptoms. Not what the patient was reporting, but what they were not. Lucien listened without speaking. His face went through a controlled sequence, attention, tightening, the specific clenching that happened around his jaw when something landed hard. And by the end he was sitting very still with his hands flat on his thighs and his eyes on DeLuca, and something had solidified behind his face that Elena had not seen there before. The evidence, Lucian said when DeLuca finished. Elena put the phone on the table. Everyone looked at it. My mother's coat, Elena said. 11 years. She looked at Lucien. We need to know what's on it before we decide how to use it. And we need someone who can access the data without Voss being able to intercept the signal. I have a man, Lucien said, 40 minutes from here. Then we go. Elena stood. She looked at her mother. Can you walk? I've been walking through worse than this for 15 years, Carol said, and stood up. They were almost at the door when DeLuca said, Elena. She stopped. There's one more thing, he said. Something I debated telling you tonight because the timing is... He stopped, looked at his hands. In 45 minutes of detailed, controlled disclosure, it was the first time he'd looked at his hands. Harlan Voss has a son running the Voss Syndicate. I told you this. You did. What I did not tell you, DeLuca said, is that Harlan Voss's son has been using a different name professionally for the past 6 years. Elena waited. His professional name, DeLuca said, is Marcus Carver. The warehouse was completely silent. Elena turned slowly and looked at Lucian. Lucian's face had gone somewhere she'd never seen it go. Past the controlled distance, past the managed anger, all the way down to something that was raw and structural and old. The expression of a man who has just understood that the person he trusted most in the world for the longest period of his life was never who he believed him to be. Not a consigliere who went corrupt. A son doing his father's work, placed inside an empire for 15 years, waiting. He's not Carver, Elena said. No, DeLuca said. He's Voss. He's Voss, DeLuca said. Lucy stood up. He did it slowly, and when he was standing, he didn't look like himself exactly. He looked like a version of himself from which something had been removed, and nothing had yet been put back in the space it left. He looked at DeLuca, and the look was not anger, which was what Elena expected. It was something that hurt more than anger to watch. How long? Lucian said. DeLuca held his gaze. I suspected for 3 years. I confirmed it 8 months ago. 8 months? Yes. You confirmed it, Lucian said, 8 months ago. Yes. And you said nothing. DeLuca did not look away. I was building toward a moment when I could give you the evidence along with the disclosure. Without evidence, Voss would have denied it, and your response would have triggered a conflict that... He was in my house, Lucian said. The words came out very quiet, the quietest thing Elena had heard from him. He was in my house for 15 years. He sat at my table. He was at my father's funeral. He has been in every room where I have ever made a decision that mattered, and every piece of information I have ever discussed in his presence has gone directly to Harlan Voss. He stopped. For 15 years. The warehouse was very still. Elena looked at the phone on the table. She looked at her mother. She looked at Lucien, at what was happening behind his face, at the cost of 15 years of proximity to something that wanted to destroy him. Then she picked up the phone and put it back in her pocket and said, "We go. Now. Because Voss Jr., Carver, whatever his name is, knows his attempt on me this morning failed. He knows DeLuca has made contact with Carol, and he knows we're not where he put us. He is not going to wait." Nobody moved for a second. Then Lucien exhaled. One breath. And something happened. She watched it happen. Watched him take the thing that had just been done to him and put it somewhere internal, not resolved, not processed, but contained, operational. He was, she thought, very good at this. She wasn't sure if that was a strength or a wound that had healed wrong. "Move," he said. They moved. They were outside, crossing the lot toward the vehicles, the night air cold and carrying the smell of the lake from 2 miles east, when Sarto's radio crackled. He held it to his ear. His face did not change expression, which in Elena's experience meant the expression was being deliberately held in place against something that wanted to change it. "What?" Lucien said. Sarto lowered the radio. "The Callahan and Voss syndicate families have issued a joint statement," he said. "They've declared the photographic evidence authentic." A pause. "They've given you 12 hours to surrender yourself to a joint tribunal for the murder of Marcus Brenn, or they consider the alliance active." 12 hours, Elena said. 11 now, Sarto said. Elena looked at the phone in her pocket, at the lot around them, the chain-link fence, the dead-end street, at Lucien, who was standing in the Calumet cold with the specific stillness of a man who has just watched the last conventional option close. At her mother, who was standing next to DeLuca with her purse over her arm, like she was waiting for a bus, which was the most Carol Whitmore thing Elena had ever seen her do, and which made something in Elena's throat tighten briefly before she pushed it back. 11 hours. She put her hand in her pocket and closed it around her father's phone. Whatever was on it, it needed to be enough to dismantle 30 years of cover and a federal official's reach in 11 hours, in a city where the criminal families were already convening against the one man who had the resources to help her do it. And that man was currently standing in a dark parking lot in the Calumet district, having just learned that his entire adult life had been surveilled by an enemy wearing a trusted face. She thought about the contract she'd signed. 1 year, clean exit at 12 months. A life she was supposed to return to afterward. The studio apartment and the broken radiator, and the ER shifts and the gas station coffee. She thought about her father mailing a phone to a dying woman in Ohio. She thought about the closed casket on a dry Wednesday morning in October, and what it meant that the casket had been closed, and what her father had known in the last days before he disappeared, and whether he had been afraid. She thought, he wasn't afraid. He hid the evidence. Afraid people destroy evidence. People who believe in something hide it for someone else to find. He had believed someone would find it. He had apparently believed it would be her. She looked at Lucien. Can your man access the data in the field, or does he need a controlled location? Controlled location, Lucien said. The estate. Then we go to the estate, Elena said. And on the way, you tell me everything you know about Harlan Voss's current federal relationships, because when we open that phone, we're going to need to know exactly which doors the evidence opens and which ones are already locked from the inside. She walked to the vehicle. She got in. She did not look back at the warehouse, at the dead-end street, at the geography of the last hour. She looked forward the way she always did, because backward was where the things she couldn't change lived, and she had never in her life found anything useful there. But she was aware, in a way she hadn't been before tonight, that forward was not the clean direction she had always made it in her mind. Forward was where Harlan Voss was. Forward was where Carver, young Voss, placed and patient and waiting, was executing the final stage of a plan that had started before Elena was old enough to understand what her father did for a living. Forward was where 11 hours ended. She buckled her seatbelt. The convoy moved. And in her pocket, against her palm, her father's phone was warm from being held, and she did not let go of it for the entire drive back through a city that did not know yet how badly it was about to be asked to reckon with itself. The convoy moved north through the industrial corridor, with its headlights cutting pale channels through the dark, and Elena sat in the back seat with her father's phone in her closed hand and counted what they had. They had the phone, contents unknown. They had DeLuca's testimony, which was the word of a man whose entire existence was legally compromised. They had 11 hours, less now, 10 and a half, before the Callahan-Voss coalition declared active war against the Moretti organization. They had a technical specialist 40 minutes from the estate who could access a 15-year-old phone without triggering a signal intercept. They had Lucis Yen, who had spent the last 20 minutes in the front seat saying nothing, which Elena was learning to interpret as a specific kind of processing rather than shutdown. He was running something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the angle of his head. Whatever it was, she needed it to finish before they reached the estate. The Callahan family, she said, are they genuinely convinced by the photographs, or are they convenient? Lucian turned slightly. Meaning, are they looking for an excuse to move against you that they were already looking for, or did Voss actually persuade them? A pause. Callahan has wanted the North Territory distribution rights for 3 years. Bren was the obstacle. Bren is now dead, and the framing puts the responsibility on me, which removes me as a second obstacle. He paused. They're not dupes. They're opportunists who have been handed an opportunity. Which means if we disprove the photographs, they step back. If we disprove them convincingly enough. And the Voss Syndicate. The Voss Syndicate follows the Callahan family's lead publicly, Lucian said. Privately, they follow Harlan Voss's directives. Separating the two is what we need to do, Elena said. If we expose Harlan Voss, if the evidence on this phone is what DeLuca believes it is, the Voss Syndicate has no Voss to report to. They're a structure without a directive. And Callahan, once they understand they've been positioned by a federal criminal to do his work for him, has an incentive to stand down to avoid exposure. That's the architecture, yes. Then the phone is everything. Yes, Lucian said. They sat in that for a moment. You knew DeLuca was managing information, Elena said. Not an accusation. A statement. I knew he knew more than he was telling me, Lucius said. I didn't know the specific shape of what he was holding. A pause. I should have pressed harder. You were managing him the way he was managing you, Elena said. Both of you holding partial information and waiting for the right moment. And Carver, Voss Jr., was watching both of you do it and adjusting accordingly. Yes. How does a man spend 15 years in your house, she said, and you don't? She stopped. That was the wrong question. She knew the answer to that question. She'd spent 12 years watching families in the ER who'd had the wrong answer to that question. How does someone do this without you knowing? Because trust was structural, and structural things were the last things you examined, because examining them meant admitting the structure might be wrong, and if the structure was wrong, then nothing built on it was safe. She didn't finish the question. Lucien answered it anyway. He was there when I was 14, he said. He was there when my father died. He was in the room for everything. A pause. You don't interrogate the walls. They arrived at the estate at midnight. Renato had the gate open before the convoy stopped. Elena got out with Carol on one arm and the phone in the other hand, and she moved through the front door and into the interior rooms, away from the exterior walls, away from windows, into the deeper architecture of the house. And she did not stop until they were in the library, which had no exterior exposure and which she had already categorized as the most defensible interior space she'd seen on her brief tour of the building. The technical specialist arrived 18 minutes later. His name was Kite, apparently literally, or at least functionally, because that was the only name anyone used. And he was younger than she'd expected, early 30s, with the specific thinness of someone who forgot to eat, and the dark-circled eyes of someone who slept badly, and a look of complete professional absorption when she put the phone in his hands that suggested he had already forgotten she existed. He worked on the phone for 23 minutes. No one spoke. Elena sat across from him. Carol sat on the couch with a cup of tea that Renato had produced without being asked, because Renato was apparently the kind of person who understood what situations required before the situations finished developing. Lucien stood at the interior wall with his arms crossed and watched Kite work with the patience of a man who had learned that impatience did not accelerate technical processes. DeLuca arrived at 12:57. He'd come separately with two of his own people, and when he walked into the library, the specific charge of his presence and Lucia's in the same room was something Elena registered in her body before her brain cataloged it. The air pressure shifting, the way two systems of controlled authority redistributed the space between them. Nobody said anything. Kite said, "Okay." Everyone looked at him. He had the phone connected to a device Elena didn't recognize, and on his laptop screen a directory had opened. Dozens of files, dates ranging from 2003 to October 2004, the last entry time stamped 4 days before Robert Whitmore disappeared. "What's there?" Elena said. "Wire transfer records," Kite said. "A lot of them, spanning." He scrolled. "Looks like 6 years of payments, offshore routing through 4 shells, and..." He stopped scrolling, leaned forward. "Okay, this is..." He stopped again. "What?" Lucien said. "These aren't just transfer records," Kite said. "There are account origination documents, real names attached to the shells, and..." He opened a second file. "Correspondence, email archive. Someone saved the full chain." He looked up. "These are emails between an H. Voss and the payment recipients. He signed them. First name, last name, position title." The library was very still. "He signed them," Elena said. "On a federal government email server," Kite said. "That's the routing header. The account is federal, which means they're authenticated," Elena said. "The server stamp authenticates the sender. You can't fabricate a federal routing header retroactively. Not without access to the original server infrastructure," Kite said, "which nobody outside federal IT has." Elena looked at Lucien. Lucien looked at her. "How long to make copies?" Elena said to Kite. "Encrypted, multiple destinations." 20 minutes. "Do it now." Kite started typing. Elena looked at the room, at her mother with the tea, at DeLuca standing near the door, at Lucien still at the wall. And she ran the next sequence in her head the way she ran a complex procedure in her head before beginning, mapping each step so that when the moment came, the execution was clean. "We need a channel to the Callahan family," she said to Lucien. "Not through the usual network, direct. Someone they trust." "Their lawyer," Lucien said. "Patrick Callahan uses a firm in the loop. The senior partner has been the intermediary for every multifamily communication in this city for 20 years. Can you reach him tonight? It's past 1 in the morning. Can you reach him? Yes. Tell him we're requesting a 2-hour extension on the tribunal deadline, and we will provide proof of fabrication in exchange. Tell him the fabrication originates from a federal source and constitutes criminal conspiracy to incite violence between private organizations." She paused. "Don't mention Voss by name yet. We give the name with the evidence, not before." Lucien looked at her with the expression she was starting to recognize. The slight recalibration, the revision. He pulled out his phone. While he was on the call, Elena crossed to DeLuca. She kept her voice low. "Harlan Voss knows by now that the morning attempt failed," she said. "He knows Carver is exposed. How does he move next?" DeLuca considered this without rushing. "Harlan is not a man who improvises," he said. "He has contingencies. If the primary operation, using the family coalition to destroy Lucien, is compromised, he falls back to direct action." "Direct action against what?" "Against the evidence," DeLuca said. "If he knows the phone has been accessed, he will attempt to discredit the chain of custody. He'll claim the files are fabricated, that Moretti produced them, that there is a coordinated criminal conspiracy to frame a federal official." He paused. "Which is a credible story in certain contexts, because Lucien is in fact the head of a criminal organization. So we need a non-criminal source to authenticate and present the evidence," Elena said, "or an irrefutable technical authentication that preempts the credibility attack." Elena turned. "Kite." He looked up from the laptop. "The federal email server routing header," she said. "Is there a verification process? Something that produces an independent confirmation that the emails originated from that server? Kite's eyes went to the ceiling briefly, the look of someone running a technical map in their head. There's a federal records verification system. Journalists use it for FOIA confirmation. If the emails are authentic, the header hash would match the archive record. He paused. I can submit a query. Automated response, usually 2 to 4 hours. Submit it now, Elena said. If Voss has contacts inside federal IT. He probably does, Elena said, which means the query will alert him that someone is verifying, which tells us something about his response timeline. Kite looked at her. You want to use it as a provocation. I want to know how fast he moves when he's afraid, Elena said. Submit it. Kite submitted it. Lucian finished his call. He crossed to Elena. Callahan's lawyer has the message. He's consulting with the family. We should know within the hour whether they'll extend. Good. Elena looked at the time. We have 8 hours and 40 minutes, even with an extension. Kite's verification query will either return a hash match or trigger Voss's response network. Either way, we'll know more in 2 hours than we know now. And Carver, Lucian said. The name came out with a specific weight, not Voss Jr., Carver. The name he'd used for the man for 15 years, and the habit of it was apparently stronger than the knowledge that it was wrong. He'll know we have the phone, Elena said. If he didn't know before Kite's query, he'll know when it goes through. She looked at Lucien. Where would he go? Not where Voss would put him? Where would he go? You know this man. Something in Lucian's jaw moved. The West Safe House, he said, on the other side of the river. It's a property that's been in the organization since my father's time. Carver established the security protocols for it. He knows its layout better than anyone. A pause. It's also where the organization's financial records for the last decade are archived. Physical records? Elena said. Physical and digital. The hardware is air-gapped, offline, which means if he gets to that hardware and wipes it, you have no organizational financial record, Elena said, which means no way to demonstrate a legitimate restructuring to the families, no way to separate your operation from Voss's network in any documentable way, and Voss gets to define the narrative. Yes, Lucien said. How quickly can you get a team to the West Safe House? 15 minutes. Then they need to be moving in the next 60 seconds, Elena said, because if Carver is running, that's where he's running too. Lucien was already on the phone. He spoke for 30 seconds, clipped and precise, and Elena could hear in the background the sounds of the estate shifting again. Doors, footsteps, the organizational machinery moving. Then Kite said, We have a problem. Everyone looked at him. His laptop screen had changed, not the file directory, a separate window, a messaging application, something Elena didn't recognize. The query triggered a response, Kite said, not from federal records, from an external system. Someone intercepted the verification request and rerouted it. How is that possible? DeLuca said. Someone with access to the federal IT routing layer, Kite said. They'd need... He stopped, looked at the screen. There's a message attached to the reroute text. Elena crossed to him, looked at the screen. The message was 4 words. Bring the phone. Alone. Below it, an address. Not in the city. Industrial, south. The coordinates placing it near a stretch of the Calumet River where the old steel infrastructure sat empty and cold. Below the address, a second line. Your mother's treatment stops at 6 a.m. unless you come. Elena looked at the screen for 4 seconds. She was not surprised. She noted this, the absence of surprise, which meant some part of her had already mapped this possibility and accounted for it. The part of her that understood that Voss, unable to reach the phone through Carver, would default to the most reliable lever, the thing she could not calculate around, could not outmaneuver, could not survive losing. Her mother's life. She straightened up. She turned around. She looked at Carol. Carol was looking back at her from the couch with the empty teacup and the expression Elena still couldn't fully read. The layered expression, guilt and love, and the specific exhaustion of 15 years of carrying something too heavy in too much silence. I know what you're thinking, Carol said. I'm not thinking anything yet, Elena said. You're thinking you're going to go. I'm thinking about options. Elena, Carol put the teacup down. Your father thought about options too. For 3 years he thought about options, and then he ran out of time because he was thinking alone. She stood up. You are not alone. Lucian said, You're not going. Elena turned to him. You are not going to that address, he said. The sentence was quiet, but under it something was running very hot. Voss will take the phone and, I know what Voss will do, Elena said. Then you understand why you're not going. I understand, Elena said, that Voss has a direct line to my mother's medical care, and he has just told me he will cut it, which means I have, she looked at the screen. Less than 6 hours before that becomes an irreversible consequence. She looked at Lucian. My mother's cancer treatment is not a negotiating chip I can walk away from. Elena, I'm not going alone, she said. The sentence came out with a clarity that was not bravado and not recklessness. It was what it was, an assessment of options that had narrowed to a single viable path, and the specific cold water calm of someone who had reached that assessment and was moving forward through it. I'm going with a plan, with backup positioned outside the perimeter, with the evidence already copied to multiple destinations so that what I bring to that address is not the only copy. And I need Voss to believe that it is. The library was quiet for a moment. The copies, Elena said to Kite. Where did you send them? 3 encrypted locations, Kite said. 2 offshore, 1 domestic. Domestic where? Kite looked at her. A law firm server. Standard encrypted deposit. Which firm? He told her. She looked at DeLuca. Something passed between them. Your attorney, Elena said. Yes, DeLuca said. Can he present the evidence to a federal prosecutor independently of anything that happens tonight? If I authorize it, DeLuca said. Yes. Authorize it now, Elena said. Not contingent on what happens tonight. Now. Regardless. DeLuca held her gaze for a moment. Then he made a call. While he was on the phone, Elena went to her room. She changed her shoes to the flat boots she'd packed. Laced, ankle height, the ones she wore on long ER shifts when she knew she'd be on her feet for 12 hours. She changed her sweater for a darker one. She put her phone in her left pocket and her father's phone, the original, which Kite had returned to her after copying, in her right. She looked at herself in the mirror again. She'd done this once tonight already, in the other mirror, in the other context. She looked the same as she had then. This continued to surprise her. She went back down. Lucien was in the hallway at the bottom of the stairs. He was alone. He'd sent the others ahead, or into other rooms, and the hallway was quiet with the old house quiet she'd cataloged on her first night. He was standing with his hands at his sides, not performing stillness. Just still. There's a route, he said, around the south perimeter. My team will be at a holding point 200 meters from the address, close enough to respond in under a minute and a half. 90 seconds, Elena said. Yes. Voss will have swept the immediate perimeter. Yes. 200 meters is outside a standard sweep, maybe outside. He held her gaze. Maybe. Maybe, Elena said. I don't want to send you in there with maybe. Then give me something better than maybe. He reached into his coat, produced a device she almost didn't recognize, like small, flat, the kind of thing that was designed not to be noticed. Transmitter, he said. Embedded signal, short range but clean. It activates when you press the case twice. He held it out. When it activates, my team moves. They won't wait for a signal from you. The activation is the signal. She took it. It was warm from his coat pocket, and she was aware of his hand and hers and the deliberateness of the transfer, the weight of a thing being given carefully. If Voss's people find it, she said. It reads as a standard key fob, he said. Unless someone is specifically looking for it, it won't be recognized. She put it in her boot, against the inner ankle. She stood back up. The evidence is already gone, she said. Regardless of what happens at that address, the evidence reaches a federal prosecutor tonight. You understand what that means. Whatever Voss does to me or to the phone, the case against him proceeds. I know, Lucian said. Then I need you to understand something else, Elena said. She was looking at him directly and she wasn't managing it. She wasn't calculating the angle of disclosure, wasn't making a strategic decision about what to show. She was too far past the moment when those calculations applied. If something goes wrong in there and the 90 seconds isn't enough, I need you to make sure my mother's care continues. Not through your organization's arrangement, something legitimate, a trust, an endowment, something that doesn't depend on your organization's continued operation or on anything Voss can reach. He looked at her for a long moment. It's already arranged, he said. She blinked. What? When I put the appendix in the contract, he said, guaranteeing your mother's care, I structured it as an independent trust, not contingent on the marriage, not contingent on my organization. The funds are already deposited. Carol Whitmore's medical care is funded for the rest of her life regardless of what happens to me or to anything else. He paused. I did it before you signed. I told you. The care was separate from everything. I meant it. Elena stood in the hallway with this information. She thought about the contract, the large number in Clause 22. She'd thought it was a settlement figure. She'd thought it was what she earned at the end of the year. She looked at Lucien. The settlement in Clause 22, she said. Is your mother's care fund? Yes, he said. The number you see in the clause is the principal of the trust. She had been too afraid to spend the money. She had been too afraid to name what the number meant. And he had put it there for Carol before he knew whether Elena would sign, before he knew what the next year would contain, before he knew any of the things that had happened in the 48 hours since she'd walked into her mother's kitchen and found 3 men waiting. She looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she said, I'm going to come back from that address. I know, he said. I'm not saying it for comfort. I'm saying it because I intend to. I know, he said again, and his voice had something in it she didn't try to name right now because there wasn't time. She turned toward the door. Elena, he said. She stopped. Don't give him the phone, Lucien said. Whatever he says, don't give it to him. I know, she said. She went out. The night was cold and the city was dark, and the car that took her south was driven by a man she didn't know whose name she didn't ask, because she was conserving every resource she had for what was in front of her. She sat in the back and she breathed basso, in through the nose, 4 counts, out through the mouth, 6 counts. And she held her father's phone and she thought about a man who had spent 3 years building a case and who had known at the end that he was out of time and had mailed a phone to a woman in Ohio and then gone to work on a Wednesday morning in October and not come home. She thought, he knew what he was walking into. She thought, he went anyway. The address resolved from coordinates into a location as they drove. She could see it on her phone's map, the Calumet River corridor, the old steel infrastructure that the city had been trying to decide what to do with for 30 years and hadn't yet. The car stopped at the outer edge of the mapped perimeter. She got out. She walked. The facility was a former steel processing plant. 3 connected buildings, the main structure still largely intact, the kind of industrial architecture that was more honest than it was beautiful. All exposed girders and corrugated walls and the specific weight of things built to last rather than to be admired. Light from inside, visible through gaps in the corrugated walls. She noted the exits she could see. 2 on the south side, 1 loading dock on the east, the river on the north. The river was 30 feet below the north wall's edge, which she stored as information without deciding yet what it was information for. 2 men at the main entrance. She saw them before they saw her because she came from an angle. They saw her at 15 feet, and one of them moved forward, and she let him because the alternative was complicated. He searched her, found the phone in her right pocket. She allowed this, stood with her arms out and her breathing controlled. He found her phone in her left pocket and took it. He found the transmitter in her boot, and she felt everything in her tighten before she heard him say, "Key fob." He dropped it back. She felt it settle against her ankle. They took her inside. The main floor of the plant was large and cold and smelled of rust and river water and something chemical from whatever had been processed here the last time it was operational. The catwalks above were iron, old, with handrails that had been stressed by decades of weather. Below them, the main floor, scarred concrete, empty equipment mounts, the ghosts of machinery long removed. At the far end of the main floor, in the light of a portable generator and 3 standing work lamps, Harlan Voss was waiting. He was older than Elena had constructed him from the facts. Mid-70s, compact, with white hair, and the precise bearing of a man who had spent 40 years in formal institutional environments and had internalized their posture. He was not what she'd imagined. She'd imagined something that looked dangerous. He looked like a department head. He looked like the kind of man who signed off on budgets and attended retirement parties and had his name on a building somewhere that nobody paid attention to. He was looking at her the way DeLuca had looked at her in the warehouse. Assessment, attention, interest, but without DeLuca's specific quality of weight. There was something lighter in Voss's attention, something that was close to pleasure. Beside him, slightly behind, was Carver, the man she'd known as Carver. Silver temples, tailored jacket, the jaw like a cinder block that looked different now that she knew it belonged to a Voss rather than to a man named Carver. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read clearly from across the floor, but which she thought might be something close to relief, as if a prolonged performance was approaching its conclusion. "Miss Whitmore," Harlan Voss said. His voice carried across the empty floor easily, a voice trained to carry. "Mr. Voss," Elena said, "you know who I am?" Not a question, satisfied. "Yes." "And you came anyway." He looked at her with the pleasure-interest expression. "You're very like your father." She kept walking toward him. 12 feet, 10, 8. She stopped at 6, which was the distance she'd decided on in the car because 6 feet was conversation distance and also the distance at which she could read his face clearly and the distance at which she was close enough to the work lamps that the light was on her face rather than in her eyes. "The phone," Voss said. "First," Elena said, "tell me about Bren." Voss looked faintly amused. "I'm not here for a conversation." "I know what you're here for," Elena said. "I'm here for a conversation. Marcus Bren was on my father's task force. He stayed silent for 20 years, and then he decided to come forward, and now he's dead. Did you enjoy it? Killing someone who'd obeyed you for 20 years the moment they stopped being useful?" Something in Voss's expression moved. The pleasure interest shifted, not to anger, to the specific coolness of a man who had learned to process being challenged without showing that it registered. "The phone," he said again. "My father mailed it to his sister-in-law," Elena said, "who held it for 6 months and then mailed it back to my mother, who kept it in a coat in her closet for 11 years. She looked at him. He was afraid to send it directly to Carol because he knew you'd be watching his immediate family. So he sent it sideways through a connection you hadn't thought to monitor, and it worked. For 15 years it worked." She paused. "He was smarter than you." The coolness in Voss's face developed an edge. "He was smarter than you?" Elena said again. "And you killed him anyway. And for 15 years you've been managing the consequences of having killed someone smarter than you. And here you are in an abandoned steel plant at 2 a.m. trying to retrieve a phone from his daughter." She reached into her pocket, produced the phone, held it up between them. "You want it? Here it is." Voss looked at the phone. "The thing about evidence," Elena said, "is that it's only powerful when it's the only copy." She watched his face. She watched it very carefully, the way she watched a patient's face in the moment after delivering bad news for the specific sequence of recognition. And she saw it arrive. Not instantly. It took 2 seconds, which was 1 second longer than she'd expected, which told her something about how carefully he'd been managing his own certainty. Then his face went entirely still, and in the stillness she saw what lived underneath the department head presentation, something very old and very cold and genuinely, functionally dangerous. "Where are the copies?" he said. "Already delivered," Elena said. "A federal prosecutor received the full file package 40 minutes ago. Independent authentication of the email routing headers is processing through the Federal Records Verification System as we speak." She held his gaze. "The evidence leaves this building with me, or it doesn't matter. It's already done." Carver moved. A small movement, a shift in weight, and Elena's whole body registered it peripherally without moving her eyes from Voss. "You're bluffing," Voss said. "I'm a nurse," Elena said. "I spend 12 hours a day telling people the truth about things they don't want to hear. I'm not practiced at bluffing. I'm practiced at clarity." Voss's jaw tightened. It was the first physical tell she'd seen from him. "Even if you've sent copies..." "The chain of custody is clean," Elena said. The emails are authenticated. The wire transfer records are attached. The offshore shell documentation traces directly to accounts you opened under your own name in 2001. My father kept your name on everything." She paused. He was building a case, not a negotiation. He wanted it airtight. "It is." Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Carver. The look between them was brief, and Elena couldn't decode all of it, but she decoded enough. There was a question in Voss's look and an answer in Carver's, and the answer was not the one Voss wanted. Then Carver looked at Elena, and something happened in his expression that she didn't expect, something that was not the performance she'd watched him run since her mother's kitchen, something that sat underneath the performance, older, and which looked— she was not certain she would not have named it with confidence in any other context, like it might have been relief. "Dad," Carver said. The word hit the empty floor, and the catwalks above it and bounced around in the cold air. "It's over," Carver said. Voss turned to look at him fully. "The evidence is out," Carver said. "She's right. We knew the phone existed. We knew if someone accessed it." He stopped. "It's over. The play is done." "Marcus, I've been doing this for 15 years, Carver said. His voice was very flat, not emotional. Flat in the way things got when they'd been compressed for so long that emotion had been replaced by something structural. "I've been Carver for 15 years. I've sat in Lucien Moretti's house and I've listened to everything he said, and I've reported it to you, and I've waited for this moment, and it has come, and the evidence is already out." He looked at his father. "There is no move left. There is no contingency for this." Voss's face had gone somewhere Elena hadn't seen it go, past the coolness, past the managed presentation, all the way down to something that was the raw material under all of it. Not grief, not regret, but the specific, devastating expression of a man watching 30 years of structure collapse in real time and having nothing behind it. Then he looked at Elena with that expression, and he reached into his coat. Elena pressed the transmitter twice. She dropped left simultaneously, not away from Voss, toward the nearest work lamp, which she caught with both hands and drove at him in the same motion, the hot metal of the lamp housing burning her palms, not caring, driving it between herself and whatever he'd reached for. The lamp connected with his arm. The gun in his hand, black, compact, skidded across the scarred concrete, and Elena heard it stop somewhere in the dark to her right. Voss was down on one knee. She stood over him with the lamp still in her burned hands and her breath coming hard and fast and her heart doing the thing it did in a trauma bay when the situation had just degraded and everything narrowed to the present second. Carver had not moved. She looked at him. He was standing with his hands at his sides, not reaching, not moving, looking at his father on the floor with the flat structural expression and something under it that was harder to read. He looked at Elena. "I'm not going to run," he said. She believed him. She didn't know why, but she believed him, and she filed the reasons for examination later. 90 seconds. She counted them. Her palms were burning. The thermal contact, the lamp housing, she'd assess it later. No blistering she could feel, probably superficial. She kept the lamp between herself and Voss, who had not gotten up from the floor but whose eyes were moving, calculating still, even on the floor, even now, calculating because that was what he was. At 87 seconds, the south entrance exploded inward. Lucien's team moved through the space the way water moved through a gap, immediately, completely, filling every available angle before the people in the space had fully registered their presence. Elena counted 4, 6, 8, and behind them Sarto and behind Sarto. Lucien. He crossed the floor at something faster than walking and stopped 6 feet from Elena, and his eyes went over her in the same inventory she did on patients, checking, cataloging, assessing. And they stopped on her hands. "Superficial," she said before he asked. He looked at Voss on the floor. His jaw was very tight. "He reached for the weapon," Elena said. "I had the lamp. I used it." Lucien crouched in front of Voss. Up close, at floor level, the two of them looking at each other. The man who had placed a surrogate son inside Lucien's organization for 15 years, and the man who had trusted that son with everything. Elena watched the two of them look at each other, and she did not try to read all of what was in it because some of it was not hers to read. "Harlan Voss," Lucien said. Quiet. You are going to stand up, and you are going to walk out of here with my people, and you are going to the federal system, because that is the only thing that saves you from the alternative. Voss looked at him. The calculating eyes. Still running, even now. Then he looked at Carver. Carver looked back at him, and Carver said to Lucian without looking away from his father, "The evidence your organization needs, the financial records at the West Safe House. I can give you the full archive access, the hardware admin credentials, the encryption keys, everything." A pause. "In exchange for processing through federal channels. Not your people. Federal." Lucien looked at him for a long moment. "You'll testify," Lucien said. "Yes," Carver said. "To everything. Voss, the network, the placement, the operation. Bren." "Yes," Carver said. The word came out with the weight of 15 years behind it, and underneath the weight, the specific, unmistakable texture of something that had been decided long before tonight. Elena looked at Carver. She thought about the warehouse, his face when DeLuca said his real name, the expression she'd thought might be relief. She understood now. He had been waiting for this to end for a very long time. She looked at Lucien. He looked at her. The space between them and this cold, rusted, river-smelling building at 2:30 in the morning held everything the last 48 hours had placed in it. Her mother's kitchen, the contract, the glass with the bullet hole, the warehouse, the phone warm from being held, and neither of them tried to address it because there was still too much in front of them. "We take them both out," Elena said. "Yes," Lucien said. "And then," she said, "we call the prosecutor." He nodded. She walked to where the gun had slid on the concrete floor. She didn't touch it. She marked its location, the way she marked the location of instruments on a surgical field, knowing where things were without needing to hold them. She turned back. Harlan Voss was on his feet. Two of Lucien's men had him, one on each arm, and he was standing with the department head bearing restored as much as a man on the floor of an industrial plant with burned hands and a federal case arriving in the morning could restore his bearing, and he was looking at Elena with an expression she recognized after a moment, as the one she hadn't expected from him. Not anger, not calculation. He was looking at her the way people sometimes looked at her after the worst news of their lives, when the knowing had finally settled into the body, and the fighting was done, and what was left was just the fact of what had happened. He was looking at her like she had just told him something true. She held his gaze. "My father was 3 weeks from the U.S. Attorney's office," she said. "He had everything. You knew he had everything, and you were afraid." She paused. "You've been afraid for 15 years. That's over now." She turned away from him. She walked toward the south exit, toward the cold outside air, toward her phone that one of Lucien's men returned to her at the door, toward the specific, ongoing, unresolved future that was going to require more than one night to build. Behind her, the sound of the facility, the generator, the lights, the movement of people, the specific acoustic weight of a place where something had just ended. She pressed the phone to her ear and called a number she'd memorized at 12:47 that morning. When Kite had read it off his screen, and she'd filed it in the place in her brain where she put things she knew she would need. The federal prosecutor's office answered on the second ring. She told them her name. She told them what she had. She was still talking when she walked out into the cold Calumet air, and behind her the old steel plant stood against the dark sky the way old things stood, massive and weathered, and finally, at this particular hour, done holding its secrets. The federal prosecutor's name was Diane Marsh, and she had been awake since midnight for reasons unrelated to Elena Whitmore, which meant when Elena's call came through she was already at her desk with coffee going cold beside her keyboard, and the specific attentiveness of someone whose brain had decided sleep was no longer on the schedule. Elena talked for 11 minutes without stopping. She laid the architecture, Voss, the 2003 task force, Robert Whitmore, the email archive, the wire transfer records, the offshore shells, Bren's death, Carver's placement, the fabricated photographs framing Lucien for Bren's murder, the criminal coalition being mobilized on false evidence. She laid it in the order that made structural sense rather than the order it had happened to her, because Diane Marsh didn't need Elena's experience of the last 48 hours. She needed the case. When Elena finished, Marsh was quiet for 4 seconds. "Where are you right now?" Marsh said. "Calumet River Corridor, south side. I'm standing outside a former steel processing facility where Harlan Voss and a man known as Marcus Carver, actual name Marcus Voss, are currently in custody held by private security." Another pause. "Private security?" "The situation is complicated," Elena said. "The relevant fact is that both men are contained and neither has access to communications. The evidence package your office received 40 minutes ago is authenticated and complete. I need your office to move tonight." "Miss Whitmore, federal proceedings require—" "Harlan Voss has 30 years of federal relationships," Elena said. "Every hour he has access to those relationships is an hour the case gets more complicated. The authentication request I submitted through the Federal Records Verification System will return a hash match within the next 2 hours. That gives you independent technical confirmation before sunrise." She paused. "I'm not telling you how to do your job. I'm telling you that the evidence is real, the people who produced it are credible, and the window is now." Marsh was quiet again, longer this time. "I'm going to need a physical location for federal agents to receive the individuals in custody," Marsh said. Elena turned and looked at Lucian, who was 10 feet away and had been watching her face for the last 11 minutes. She raised her eyebrows. He produced his phone without a word, typed an address, and held the screen toward her. She read it to Marsh. 2 hours, Marsh said. 2 hours, Elena said. She hung up. Her hands were starting to hurt properly now. The adrenaline had been managing the burn from the lamp housing, but it was metabolizing, and what was underneath was the specific, honest pain of a thermal contact injury. Not severe, she could assess that accurately. Superficial dermal layer, no blistering she could feel in the dark, but persistent and getting louder. She looked at her palms in the light from her phone screen. Red. The kind of red that would take a week to fully resolve. Lucien was next to her. He looked at her hands. He didn't say anything about them, which was the right response, but he produced something from his coat that turned out to be a small first aid kit, the kind that someone who spent time in situations like this carried habitually. He held it out. "I can do it myself," Elena said. "I know," he said, and held it until she took it. She dressed her palms with what was in the kit, the cooling gel pack, the non-adhesive pads, the wrap, working by phone light in the cold outside a building where Harlan Voss was sitting on the concrete floor with 2 of Lucian's people standing over him. She did it efficiently and without fuss because it was a clinical task, and clinical tasks were where she was most comfortable. When she finished, she looked up. Lucien was watching the river. The Calumet ran black and quiet 30 feet north of where they stood, and the ambient light of the city to the north caught the surface of it in a way that was not beautiful exactly, but was specific. The particular visual texture of industrial water at night, carrying everything the city put into it without comment. "The families," Elena said. "The extension expires in—" She checked her phone. 5 hours and 40 minutes. "Marsh's office moving tonight changes the calculation," Lucien said. "When the Callahan family understands that the photographic evidence was produced by a federal criminal who has just been taken into custody, the legal exposure of acting on that evidence becomes significant. Their lawyers will advise them to stand down." "You're certain?" "The Callahan family has been doing business in this city for 40 years, Lucien said. "They haven't survived 40 years by accepting legal exposure they could avoid." He paused. "They'll stand down. And the Voss Syndicate. Without Harlan Voss directing them, they're an organization without a directive," he said. "As you said yourself, in the car." She had said that, several hours and several lifetimes ago. "Carver," she said. Lucien was quiet for a moment. "Marcus Voss," he said. The name came out with the specific care of something being handled carefully because its edges were sharp. His testimony is the structural piece that connects the financial records to Harlan's operational role. Without it, the evidence package is strong, but Harlan's lawyers can create enough noise to delay proceedings significantly. With it, he stopped. "With it, it's over," Elena said. "Yes." She looked at the river. She thought about Marcus Carver standing in that building saying it's over to his father, the flatness of it. The 15 years of flatness that had produced that specific tone. Not relief exactly, but the particular quality of a person who has been performing something for so long that when the performance ends, there is nothing immediately available to replace it. She had believed him when he said he wouldn't run. She still believed it, standing here, and she thought she would continue to believe it even when she had time to examine it more carefully. He wanted out, she said. Yes, Lucian said. I think he's wanted out for a long time. He could have come to you. He could have, Lucian agreed. He chose this way instead. Maybe he needed the evidence to be out before he could trust that the coming forward would hold. He paused. Or maybe he needed someone else to do what he didn't have the capacity to do himself. Elena looked at him. My mother. The debt. He engineered the entire sequence. Yes. Which means he chose me to be the trigger, she said. Not arbitrarily. He chose Robert Whitmore's daughter. Lucienne looked at her. Yes. She sat with that. The specific weight of having been chosen for something by a man who needed her to set in motion the end of his own performance. She couldn't decide yet how she felt about it. She put it in the file with the other things that needed more time than tonight. They took Voss and Carver out separately, 2 vehicles, with Sarto managing the transfer in the specific way Sarto managed everything. Efficiently, thoroughly, without drama. Voss went without speaking. He had reassembled his bearing by the time they walked him to the vehicle. The department head presentation restored to something close to its original form, and Elena watched him walk and thought about 30 years of a particular kind of discipline, the discipline of maintaining a surface regardless of what was happening underneath, and thought it was not so different from some of the things she had learned to do in 12 years of emergency medicine, except that the purposes were entirely opposite. Carver, Marcus Voss, looked at Elena once before he got into the second vehicle. The look was brief and contained the specific quality she'd been trying to name since the warehouse. Not gratitude, not apology, not any of the performed emotions. Just recognition. The way 2 people who have been through the same fire look at each other when the fire is done. Not warmly, not easily, but accurately. She held the look for 2 seconds. Then he got in. They drove north. She called her mother from the car. Carol picked up on the first ring, which meant she hadn't slept, which Elena had expected. It's done, Elena said. Carol was quiet for a moment. Both of them. Both of them. Federal custody within 2 hours. Another quiet. Longer. Elena could hear her mother breathing and the specific quality of the breath, the way it changed on the exhale, the loosening of something held for a very long time, was the most information she'd received from another person in the last 48 hours that wasn't tactical. Mom, Elena said. I'm here, Carol said. I know, I'll be there in 20 minutes. She was there in 17. Carol was in the library, still in her day clothes, the teacup from earlier washed and placed on the shelf because Carol washed cups when she was anxious, had done this for as long as Elena could remember, the domestic management of things as a response to the unmanageable. She looked at Elena's bandaged hands, and her face did something that was almost entirely controlled and not quite. Elena sat next to her on the couch. They sat for a while without talking. This was also a thing they could do, had always been able to do, through the years of difficulty and the particular difficulty of a household built for 3 that became a household built for 2, and then slowly, over years, adjusted to the shape of what it was. They sat in the old house quiet, and Elena felt the last 48 hours completing themselves in her body. The adrenaline fully metabolized now, what remained being the specific, honest exhaustion of a person who had run on reserves for too long. He would have found a way, Carol said eventually. Elena knew who she meant. Yes. He was already looking, Carol said, before he died. He knew Voss was going to move. He told me, he said, whatever happens, don't go looking, don't go digging, keep your head down and keep Elena safe and wait. She stopped. I kept my head down for 15 years, and it almost got us both killed anyway. You kept me safe, Elena said. That part worked. Carol looked at her. You went into a steel plant in the middle of the night to confront a federal criminal. I came back, Elena said. Carol's chin went up slightly. The armor. Then it came back down, and what was underneath was softer than Elena was used to seeing, and older. He would have liked you, Carol said, the way you are now. He always said he said you were going to be something that required a bigger word than brave. Elena looked at her hands, at the white bandaging wrap, the red visible at the edges where the wrist began. She thought about her father mailing a phone to his dying sister-in-law. The sideways send, the unconventional channel, the specific intelligence of a man who understood that the direct route was being watched and found an indirect one. She thought, I know where I get it from. She said, we'll need to talk to the prosecutors, both of us. Your relationship with DeLuca, the 15 years of knowledge, the coat lining, they'll need testimony that authenticates the chain of custody. I know, Carol said. It'll be hard, Carol said. Yes. I've been living with hard for 15 years. I expect I can manage a few more months of it. Elena almost smiled. The cancer is what it is, Carol said. Dr. Patel has the new protocol scheduled, the legitimate one, through the practice Mr. Moretti arranged. A pause. It's a better protocol than what I was getting through Vincent's contacts. The research is newer. Elena filed this. A better protocol. She would look at the research, she would look at the numbers, the trial data, the survival curves. She would do what she always did with information that mattered. Take it apart and understand it completely before she let herself feel what it meant. Get some sleep, Elena said to her mother. You too, Carol said. Soon. Carol went to bed. Renato, who had apparently been waiting in the kitchen with the patient awareness of a man who understood that some nights required a household to simply remain available, produced tea that Elena drank standing at the kitchen counter without tasting it. At 4:17 in the morning, Diane Marsh called. Federal agents are on site, Marsh said. Transfer completed. Both individuals processed and held pending arraignment. The authentication? Elena said. Hash match confirmed at 4:02, Marsh said. The email archive is authentic. The routing header matches federal server records from 2003 and 2004. A pause that had a specific quality to it. Not hesitation, but the weight of a lawyer measuring words. Miss Whitmore, the scale of what your father documented. 30 years of systematic corruption running through a federal financial intelligence unit. The number of investigations that were compromised, the number of cases that were closed or redirected. She stopped. I've been doing this for 19 years. I don't have language for it that feels adequate. My father did, Elena said. He spent 3 years building the language. He put it on a phone and mailed it to Ohio. A quiet on the line. I'll be in touch tomorrow, Marsh said. We'll need you and your mother in for formal statements. We'll be there, Elena said. She hung up, put the phone on the counter, stood in Renato's kitchen in the old Lincoln Park house and looked at the wall, at nothing in particular, at the specific blankness of a person who has been aiming at a target for 48 hours and has just watched it resolve. It was done. Not fully, not in the legal sense, not in the sense that the proceedings and the testimony and the months of untangling were done. But the thing that had been moving toward her family for 30 years, the cover-up that had started with wire transfers in 2001 and ended with her father on a dry Wednesday morning in October, and which had spent 15 more years maintaining itself at the cost of everyone it touched, that was done. She stood in the kitchen until the tea went cold. Then she went to find Lucien. He was in the East study. Not the compromise study, she noted, a different one, a room she hadn't been in yet, on the second floor with interior walls and a desk that faced the door rather than the window. The surveillance device that Carver had placed in the compromise study had been removed and documented and was presumably now evident somewhere in Marsh's chain of custody. This room was clean. Lucien had verified it personally. He was standing at the desk, not sitting, with a phone in his hand and the look of a man who had been making calls for the last hour, and was finally between them. He looked at her when she came in. He looked at her bandaged hands, at her face, at the specific quality of stillness that had replaced the driven momentum of the last several hours. Marsh called, Elena said. I know. She called me as well. He put the phone down on the desk. The Callahan family withdrew their declaration at 3:58. Their lawyer cited procedural concerns with the photographic evidence. Their lawyer cited procedural concerns, Elena said. Yes. That's a careful way to say they were about to back a federal criminal's play, and they're glad they have a reason to stop. Yes, Lucien said. It is. Elena came into the room and sat in the chair across from the desk, the visitor's chair, the same side of the desk she'd been on in his office above the river when she'd read the contract, and that felt like something that had happened to a different person in a different city, though it had been less than a week. She looked at him across the desk. The organization, she said, the restructuring you told me about, turning it into a legitimate security and logistics operation. He held her gaze. Yes. DeLuca told me you've been planning it for 3 years. DeLuca talks, Lucien said, with something that wasn't quite dryness but was adjacent. How real is it? He was quiet for a moment. The infrastructure exists, he said. The security and logistics framework has been built over the last 2 years. The clients are legitimate, international, corporate, a few governmental contracts. The transition requires extricating the organization from the relationships that currently define it, which is, he paused, complicated, dangerous, and slower than I'd like because moving too fast creates vulnerabilities that the remaining criminal families would exploit. But it's real. Yes, he said. It's real. She looked at him, at the desk between them, at the room's controlled light, at the specific quality of a man who had just spent 48 hours in a situation where everything he'd built and everything he'd trusted had been tested simultaneously, and who was sitting on the other side of it looking, not undamaged, not unchanged, but intact, structurally intact, which was different from undamaged and mattered more. I need to ask you something, Elena said. Yes. When you built the contract, she said, the appendix, the independent trust for my mother's care, structured before I signed, not contingent on anything. She stopped. Why? He looked at her steadily. Because she was sick, he said, and her debt was zeroed. And the reason her debt existed was that someone in my operational sphere had deliberately steered her toward a predatory lending network. The care arrangement was an obligation, not contractual, just an obligation. That's not the whole answer, Elena said. He was quiet. Why did you put it in Clause 22 specifically, she said. The clause I would read most carefully, the exit clause. Why put the trust figure where it would look like a settlement? He looked at the desk for a moment, then at her. Because I wanted you to know it was there, he said. And I wanted you to understand that it was separate, without having to explain it, because explaining it would have been... He stopped. It would have been a different kind of conversation than the one we were having. She sat with that. You were concerned, she said, that if you explained it directly, I'd think you were using it as leverage. Yes. Because you were also using everything else as leverage. Yes, he said. I was. The debt structure, the timeline, the information about your father. I used all of it to bring you here. He held her gaze. And the trust was the one thing I didn't want to use, so I put it where you'd find it yourself. Elena looked at her hands, at the white wrap, slightly loose now at the left wrist where she'd applied it with her right, which was not her dominant hand. She retightened it with careful fingers and thought about the geometry of the thing he'd just described. All the leverage on one side and the one thing that wasn't leverage placed where she'd find it herself. And thought about what that said about who he was, and thought that it said something complicated and not fully resolved and true. The contract expires in approximately 11 months, she said. 11 months and 3 weeks, he said. Clause 22. Yes. She looked at him. I'm not going to invoke Clause 22, she said. He was very still. Not because I'm obligated to stay, she said. I want to be clear about that. The obligation ends when Marcia's office has what it needs for my testimony, which is a matter of weeks, not months. After that, I have no legal or contractual reason to remain in this house. She paused. I'm not going to invoke Clause 22 because I'm choosing not to. The East Study was quiet. Outside, the pre-dawn Chicago dark was doing what it always did at this hour, thinning at the edges, the sky losing its density before the sun had technically committed to anything. That's a different conversation than the contract, Lucienne said. Yes, Elena said. It is. I'm not sure I know how to have that conversation, he said, which was the most unguarded sentence she'd heard from him, and it landed with a weight that was proportional to how rarely he produced things like it. Neither do I, she said. I've been in emergency medicine for 12 years. My relationship with sustained, non-crisis situations is, she paused, underdeveloped. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not the ghost of a smile she'd seen in her mother's kitchen the first night. Actual. Brief and actual. We'll figure it out, she said. Yes, he said. She stood up. Her body registered the full scope of the last 48 hours in the standing. The deep muscle fatigue, the burn in her palms, the specific hollowed quality of a person who has run past all their reserves and is now operating on something below the physiological floor. She needed sleep. She needed 8 hours and then probably 4 more. And she needed to call Danny Reyes, who was going to have 17 questions, and she was going to have to answer all of them. And she needed to sit with her mother over several long cups of tea and go through everything, all of it, the 15 years of it, in the order it had happened. She had time. For the first time in 48 hours, she had time. She was almost to the door when she thought of the thing she'd been carrying since the warehouse. Since DeLuca had said your father was Robert Whitmore, and she'd said my father has been dead for 15 years, and he'd said, I know. The thing underneath all the tactical information, underneath the evidence and the testimony and the offshore shells and the authentication hashes. She stopped. He wasn't afraid, she said. Lucienne looked at her. My father, she said, when he understood what Voss was going to do, when he knew he was out of time. She was looking at the door, not at Lucienne, because some things were easier to say to an interior surface. He mailed the evidence sideways. He sent it to someone who couldn't be connected to him directly. He set it up so someone else could find it later. She paused. That's not what afraid people do. Afraid people destroy the evidence. Or they run. She stopped again. He went to work on a Wednesday morning. The room was quiet behind her. He believed someone would find it, she said. He set it up so someone could. And then he went anyway. Yes, Lucian said. That's not courage, she said. That's something else. I don't have a word for it yet. She didn't wait for him to offer one. She went out, down the hallway, up to her room, the room on the 3rd floor with the window that faced east over the gardens, and she sat on the edge of the enormous white bed and looked at the window. The sky outside was doing it now. The thinning, the preliminary color, the east horizon beginning to distinguish itself from the general dark. Still 30 minutes from sunrise. But beginning, she thought about her father's handwriting, which she couldn't actually remember. She'd been 10, and the specific memory of it had blurred over 15 years the way specific memories did, leaving only the impression of a thing rather than the thing itself. Careful handwriting, she thought. Precise. The handwriting of a man who was also a father who loved crossword puzzles and terrible puns, and who had understood, in the last days of his life, that the most important thing he could do was not survive but leave something that would matter after he didn't. She lay back on the bed. She didn't close her eyes immediately. She looked at the ceiling, at the old plaster, at the room around her that was not hers in any ownership sense, but in which she had spent 2 nights, and which had, in the way that spaces did when things happened in them, taken on a texture that was no longer neutral. She thought about the contract, the copy in her bag, the original with Marcia's office now as evidence. The 31 clauses and the appendix, the large number in clause 22 that was not a settlement but a trust, the exit clause she had just told Lucian she didn't intend to use. She thought about choice, about what it meant when something that began as the only available option became, at some later point, the chosen one, whether the transformation was retroactive, whether it changed the nature of what had come before, whether a thing done under duress could become, over time, a thing done freely. She didn't resolve it. She put it in the file. She closed her eyes. She slept. She slept through the sunrise and through the sound of the house moving into its morning rhythms below her, through Renato's footsteps and the distant sound of the city, through the specific quality of the Lincoln Park morning that was different from the South Side morning she'd grown up with in ways she couldn't fully articulate but that her body registered. She slept for 9 hours. When she woke, it was past noon and the east window was full of winter light, the kind that was bright without warmth, and her hands hurt steadily and honestly under the wrap. And she was hungry in the way she got hungry after long shifts, past hunger into the flat bodily insistence of a system that had been running on nothing and was now refusing to be polite about it. She went downstairs. Her mother was in the kitchen, not sitting, standing at the counter, in conversation with the home health nurse who had apparently been brought to the estate at some point in the morning, because Carol Whitmore was not a woman who would allow her medical management to lapse in the middle of a crisis. She was asking the nurse about the infusion schedule for the new protocol, and the nurse was answering in the specific way nurses answered patients who were also medically knowledgeable, peer-to-peer, without the simplification that went into lay explanations. And Carol was listening with the focused attention of a woman who intended to understand exactly what was being put into her body and why. Elena watched this from the doorway for a moment. Her mother looked up. Their eyes met across the kitchen. There was a whole conversation in the look. Everything that needed to be said about 15 years and a coat lining and a phone in Ohio and the specific, difficult love of a woman who had tried to protect her daughter by keeping her ignorant and had been wrong about the method while being entirely right about the love. All of it was in the look, and neither of them tried to have it yet, because Renato was producing a plate from the direction of the stove, and the nurse was finishing her sentence, and the moment for that conversation was not this moment, was a later moment, was one of many later moments they now had the specific, unlikely luxury of looking forward to. Elena sat at the table. Renato set the plate in front of her. She ate. 2 days later, she and Carol went to Diane Marsh's office. They sat across a long table from Marsh and 2 colleagues and a federal agent whose presence was quiet and thorough, and they talked for 4 hours. Carol went first. She laid the 15 years, DeLuca's visit 6 months after Robert's death, the knowledge she'd held, the phone in the coat, the decisions she'd made about what to do with what she knew and when and why. Elena went second. She laid the 48 hours. Marsh listened to all of it without interrupting, taking notes in a hand that moved fast and neat across a legal pad. And when Elena finished, Marsh put the pen down and looked at her for a moment. "The device you used to disable Voss," Marsh said. "The work lamp." "Yes," Elena said. "You hit him with it." "I redirected it at him," Elena said. "He had produced a firearm. I used the nearest available object to disrupt the draw." Marsh looked at her. Something in her expression was very slightly not neutral. "You're a nurse," she said. "Yes." 12 years. "Yes." Marsh picked up the pen again. "Noted," she said, and wrote something and moved on. The arraignments happened the following week. Elena was not present. She was back at Mercy General, her first shift since the 2 days she'd called out, working a 12-hour stretch in the ER that was ordinary in the way the ER was ordinary, coded and coded and coded, a pediatric case that shook her the way pediatric cases always did, and that she handled the way she always handled things that shook her, which was by being very precise until the precision finished the job. At 7 in the morning, she sat in the break room with a coffee and her phone and read the news item about Harlan Voss's arraignment on 43 counts, which was not the total, only the initial filing, with more to follow as Marsh's office worked through the archive. 43 counts. Robert Whitmore had built a case that covered 30 years and 400 transactions and dozens of individuals in a federal financial intelligence unit, and he had put it on a phone and mailed it to Ohio. And 30 years later, it had produced 43 counts and counting. She finished the coffee. She went back to work. 3 weeks after the arraignment, DeLuca came to the estate for dinner. This was Lucien's doing. A specific, deliberate act, Elena understood, of bringing the full truth of the last several months into a room and setting it at a table and letting it exist without management. She was there. Carol was there, which had been Elena's request, and which DeLuca had accepted without objection, though what that acceptance cost him she couldn't measure. It was not a comfortable dinner. It was honest, which was different and harder. DeLuca spoke to Carol with a directness that acknowledged what 15 years of knowing and not moving had cost. And Carol listened with the armor up, and then, slowly, partway through, with the armor down, Not because she forgave everything, but because she was too tired for armor and too intelligent for pretense. Toward the end of the dinner, DeLuca looked at Elena and said, "Your father would have been very bad at staying out of trouble." Elena looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I've noticed that seems to be genetic." Something moved across DeLuca's face. The weight and the recognition, and underneath it, something that had needed time to surface but had gotten there. He raised his glass. She raised hers. Carol watched them both and said nothing, which was its own kind of participation. Marcus Voss, she had started thinking of him by his real name, which was a specific decision she'd made and kept, entered a cooperation agreement with Marsh's office in the 4th week. The full testimony, the placement, the operation, the instructions from Harlan Voss, the management of Lucien's organization as a surveillance instrument, the staged evidence in Bren's murder. All of it. He sat across from federal prosecutors for 14 hours over 2 days, and the transcript, which Elena was not permitted to see, but which Marsh described to her in careful summary language, was comprehensive in the way that only a person who has been performing for 15 years could make it comprehensive. He remembered everything, had organized it with the precision of someone who had been keeping the inventory of his own deception in careful mental order against exactly this moment. She thought about him in that building saying it's over, and thought that whatever the cooperation agreement cost him, he had made the accounting long before he sat down with the prosecutors. She didn't try to contact him. She didn't know what she would say. The debt between them was too complicated for conventional exchange. He had engineered her mother's suffering to set in motion a sequence that ended with his own father's arrest, and he had chosen her specifically because she was Robert Whitmore's daughter, and she had done what he'd needed her to do, and neither of them had done it for the other, and both of them had done it for the same reason, even though neither of them had named the reason the same way. She thought, some debts don't get paid. They just get acknowledged. She left it there. 6 weeks after the arraignment, Lucien signed the first contracts for the Moretti Security and Logistics Corporation. She was at the estate the afternoon he signed them, and she watched him do it from across the room. The same compact, exact handwriting she'd noticed the first time. The pen moving across the signature line with the controlled motion of someone who understood that what they were signing was not a document, but a direction. He looked up when he finished. She was holding a cup of Renato's tea, standing near the interior wall, watching. "Done," he said. "First one," she said. "Yes." He set the pen down. "The others follow over the next 8 months as the existing relationships are restructured." He paused. "It's a long process." "Most things worth doing are," she said. He looked at her with the expression she had been slowly learning to read, the one that was not the managed distance and not the hot anger running under controlled consonants, but the thing under both of those, older and quieter, the expression of a man who had been alone in a specific way for a very long time and who was getting used to something different. She crossed the room. She sat down across from him, not at the visitor's distance, but closer, at the edge of the desk, and she put the teacup down. "I called Danny," she said, "your friend from the hospital. He had 17 questions. How many did you answer?" 12, she said. The other 5 required more context than the phone call had room for. "And his assessment," she looked at Lucien. "He said, and I'm quoting precisely here, that the situation sounded like the plot of something he wouldn't watch because it would stress him out." The corner of Lucien's mouth moved. The actual version. "That seems like a reasonable response." "He also said," Elena continued, "that in his professional opinion I had survived worse by using the same mechanism I always used, which was moving toward the problem and not stopping until it was resolved." "He's not wrong," Lucien said. "No," Elena said. "He isn't." She looked at her hands. The wrap was off now. The skin healed to the pink tender stage that would fade to normal in another week. The evidence of the lamp housing, growing fainter every day. She pressed her palms together lightly, feeling the last of the tenderness. "He asked if I was coming back to the South Side studio." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I had some things to figure out first," she said, "and that the broken radiator probably wasn't going to fix itself in the meantime." Lucien looked at her. "The radiator," he said. "It's been broken since October," she said, The landlord leaves notes about the recycling but doesn't fix the radiator. You could, Lucien said carefully, remain here while you figure things out. I'm aware of that option, Elena said. It would be practical, he said. Very practical, she agreed. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The East study was quiet. Outside, the Lincoln Park afternoon was doing what February afternoons did in Chicago, making light available without committing to warmth, the kind of light that suggested spring was a theoretical possibility rather than an imminent event. The contract, Elena said. Yes. You said, when I told you I wasn't going to invoke the exit clause, you said it was a different conversation than the contract. Yes, he said. I'd like to have that conversation, Elena said. At some point. Not today necessarily, because today has things in it already, but at some point. Lucien looked at her across the desk that was between them, and that had been between them in various forms since the morning she'd walked into a glass office above the river and read 31 clauses and an appendix. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the hallway before she went to the Calumet building. Not performing anything, not managing anything, just looking with the full, unguarded weight of someone who had stopped calculating and was simply being present in the moment that was actually happening. Yes, he said, at some point. Renato knocked on the open door. Carol is asking about dinner, he said, with the specific diplomatic neutrality of a man who had seen everything the last 6 weeks had produced and maintained his bearing through all of it. She has opinions about the menu. Elena looked at Renato. My mother has opinions about everything, she said. Yes, Renato said. She and I have been discussing them for the last 20 minutes. We've reached a partial agreement. Elena stood. She looked at Lucien. He was watching her with the quiet expression, and she thought that the conversation they were going to have at some point was going to be one of the harder conversations she'd had in a life that had not been short on hard conversations, and also one of the more necessary ones, and she was, in the specific, honest way of a person who had stopped pretending that necessity and difficulty canceled each other out, looking forward to it. She picked up her tea. Tell her I'll be there in 5 minutes, she said to Renato. She went to the window first, the east window, the one that faced the garden. Bare still, February bare, the soil dark and the branches holding their last of winter's shape before the season changed. But there was something in the branches, she noticed. A small brown bird, the same ordinary kind she'd seen the morning of the shooting, or possibly a different one. She had no way to know. Going about its business with the complete, total indifference of a creature that lived in the present tense. She watched it for a moment. Then she put down the tea and she went to dinner.